Hello there, and welcome. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Adjust your pillow, let your body settle into whatever position feels right. There's no rush. We have all the time in the world. Tonight we're going to explore one of humanity's most profound and puzzling questions. Why some countries are rich while others remain poor. Why geography seems to shape destiny. Why history echoes through centuries into the present moment. We'll walk slowly through mountains and coastlines, trace ancient trade routes, examine institutions and accidents of history and human choices. We're not seeking simple answers tonight, because there aren't any. Instead, we'll build understanding, layer by layer, until the complexity itself becomes clear and even beautiful. If you enjoy these calm explorations, a like and subscribe really helps reach others seeking the same peaceful way to end their day. And to those already subscribed, thank you for being part of this community. So settle in, let your shoulders drop, take a slow breath. And if you drift away before we finish, that's perfectly fine. That's what we're here for. Let's begin where all civilizations begin, with the land itself. Imagine standing on a gentle hillside in the Netherlands, looking out over a landscape that seems almost impossibly flat. The land stretches toward the horizon in shades of green, fields divided by canals dotted with windmills, stitched together by dikes that hold back the sea. The soil here is rich, deposited over millennia by rivers flowing down from the Alps and the highlands of France and Germany. The Rhine, one of Europe's great arteries of commerce, empties into the North Sea just to the north. Rotterdam, built where the river meets the ocean, is one of the world's busiest ports. Ships from everywhere, Asia, Africa, the Americas, unload their cargo here, and goods flow up the Rhine into the heart of Europe. Now picture yourself standing on a plateau in landlocked Bolivia, high in the Andes Mountains. The air is thin here, over 3,000 meters above sea level. The landscape is beautiful but harsh. Rocky peaks, sparse vegetation adapted to altitude and cold. La Paz, the world's highest capital city, clings to these mountainsides. To move goods from here to the Pacific Ocean requires crossing some of the world's most difficult terrain. There are no navigable rivers. The nearest coast is hundreds of kilometers away across mountains and desert. Everything that arrives here must be trucked or flown at great expense. These two landscapes, Dutch lowlands and Bolivian highlands, represent different starting points, different possibilities, different constraints. Geography doesn't determine everything, but it shapes what's easy and what's difficult, what's cheap and what's expensive, what develops naturally and what requires extraordinary effort to overcome. Let's think carefully about coastlines, because they matter more than we might first imagine. A coastline is where land meets water, where rivers flow into seas, where natural harbours form, where fishing becomes possible, where ships can dock and trade can happen. Countries with extensive coastlines, particularly coastlines with natural harbours protected from storms, have always had advantages in commerce. Britain, Japan, Greece, Norway, Chile. These are nations shaped by their relationship with the sea. Consider Britain as an example. It's an island, which means every part of the country is relatively close to the coast. Nowhere in Britain is more than 120 kilometres from tidal water. This made internal transport easier even before railways and roads. Rivers flowing to the sea could move goods. Ports could develop anywhere along the coast. The sea provided fish for food and highways for commerce. Being an island also offered protection. Invading Britain required naval power, which limited the number of potential attackers and allowed Britain to avoid the constant land wars that plagued continental Europe. But coastlines alone don't guarantee prosperity. Think about the long, jagged coastline of Norway, spectacular fjords cutting deep into mountainous terrain. This coastline provided excellent natural harbours and supported fishing communities, yes, but the mountains between fjords made land communication difficult. Norway remained relatively poor and isolated for much of its history, despite that magnificent coastline, until other factors, which we'll explore later, came into play. The real magic happens when coastlines combine with navigable rivers that flow reliably year-round, that don't freeze in winter or dry up in summer, that are deep enough for boats and calm enough to navigate safely. These are economic arteries that carry goods and people and ideas far inland. The Rhine, which we mentioned earlier, connects the Netherlands to Switzerland, flowing through Germany and touching France. The Mississippi connects the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes region, draining much of North America's interior. The Yangtze and the Yellow Rivers in China, the Ganges in India, the Nile in Egypt. These rivers shaped entire civilizations. Compare this to Africa, a continent about 3 times the size of Europe, but with far fewer navigable rivers. African rivers often have waterfalls and rapids that prevent navigation from coast to interior. The Congo River, second only to the Amazon in water volume, is navigable in sections but broken by cataracts that made it useless for connecting the interior to the coast until railways were built. The Niger, the Zambezi, the Nile above Aswan all have similar obstacles. This made trade more difficult, cities harder to supply, internal markets harder to integrate. Geography didn't make African development impossible, but it made it harder, more expensive, more dependent on other technologies to overcome natural barriers. Climate matters too, though we need to be careful how we think about it. There's a pattern, visible on any world map showing income levels, that wealth tends to concentrate in temperate zones, roughly between 30 and 60 degrees latitude north and south of the equator. Europe, North America, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Argentina, Chile. The wealthiest countries are mostly found in these temperate bands. Meanwhile, the tropics, the band around the equator, contain most of the world's poorest countries. Why might this be? The answers are complex, and we should be cautious about determinism, but there are real factors at work. Agricultural productivity in temperate zones has historically been higher for several reasons. Wheat, barley, and other grains that store well and provide dense nutrition grow best in temperate climates. Rice grows in both temperate and tropical zones, but tropical agriculture faced challenges that temperate zones avoided. Disease is part of the story. Mosquito-borne illnesses like malaria and yellow fever thrive in warm, humid climates. These diseases didn't just make people sick. They reduced productivity, shortened lifespans, made it harder to accumulate knowledge and capital across generations. A population constantly battling disease has less energy for other pursuits. Malaria particularly affected children, meaning that even those who survived often suffered cognitive impairment that limited their potential. Europeans who travelled to tropical regions often died in astonishing numbers. In the 18th and 19th centuries, European soldiers and colonists sent to West Africa had mortality rates of 50% or more in their first year. This created what economists call _0_, the rate at which European colonists died in different regions. And this turns out to have had enormous long-term consequences that we'll explore when we discuss institutions and colonization. But we should pause here and acknowledge something important. Climate and geography are not destiny. Singapore is located almost exactly on the equator, in a hot and humid tropical climate, and it's one of the world's wealthiest nations. Costa Rica and Botswana have done far better than their geography might predict. Meanwhile, some countries with excellent geography, temperate climates, good harbours, navigable rivers, remain poor. Geography creates tendencies, possibilities, challenges to overcome. It doesn't write the ending of the story. Natural resources present their own complicated story. You might think that countries with abundant oil, diamonds, gold, copper, or other valuable resources would naturally become wealthy. Sometimes they do. Norway's oil wealth has been carefully managed to create one of the world's highest standards of living. Botswana's diamond wealth, similarly, has been channeled toward development. But more often, abundant natural resources seem to correlate with poverty, corruption, and conflict. Economists call this the resource curse, or the paradox of plenty, and it's one of development's most puzzling patterns. Compare Norway to Nigeria. Both countries discovered massive oil reserves in the 1960s and 70s. Norway's North Sea oil made it wealthy and stable. Nigeria's oil brought corruption, conflict, environmental degradation, and persistent poverty for most citizens despite enormous oil revenues. Or consider Venezuela, which has the world's largest proven oil reserves but has experienced economic collapse. Meanwhile, South Korea and Singapore, with almost no natural resources, built prosperous economies through manufacturing and trade. Why does this happen? Several mechanisms seem to be at work. Resource wealth can make other economic activities less competitive. When oil exports bring in foreign currency, it makes the country's currency more valuable, which makes manufactured exports more expensive and less competitive internationally. This is called Dutch disease, named after the Netherlands' experience when natural gas discoveries harmed other export industries. Resource wealth also creates incentives for corruption and rent-seeking. If national wealth comes from oil wells or diamond mines rather than from productive citizens, then controlling the government becomes immensely valuable. Whoever controls the government controls resource revenues. This can lead to authoritarianism, as leaders refuse to give up power that controls such wealth. It can lead to civil war, as different factions fight to control resource revenues. And it can lead to economic stagnation, as talented people focus on capturing resource rents rather than creating new value through innovation and enterprise. But again, this isn't inevitable. It depends on institutions, on governance, on historical factors we'll explore. Resources are neither blessing nor curse inherently. They're opportunities that can be used well or poorly. Think about agricultural foundations, because these mattered enormously in shaping early development. Jared Diamond, in his book Guns, Germs and Steel, argued that the crops and animals available for domestication shaped which societies could develop agriculture, and that agriculture enabled population density, specialization, technology, and ultimately the military and economic power that some societies used to conquer others. The Fertile Crescent, the arc of land stretching from modern Egypt through Israel and Lebanon, through Syria and Iraq to the Persian Gulf, had an extraordinary concentration of plants and animals suitable for domestication. Wheat, barley, lentils, peas, flax. These crops originated here. Sheep, goats, cattle, pigs. These animals were first domesticated here. This wasn't because the people of the Fertile Crescent were more clever than people elsewhere. It was because these particular plants and animals happened to exist in this region and happened to be suitable for domestication. These crops and animals could spread relatively easily east and west along similar latitudes, similar day lengths, similar climates, similar growing seasons. The crops that worked in Mesopotamia worked in Greece and eventually in Britain, but they didn't spread as easily north-south across different climate zones. This gave Eurasia, the combined landmass of Europe and Asia, enormous advantages in early agricultural development. The Americas had their own domesticated crops, corn, potatoes, beans, squash, but fewer large animals suitable for domestication. No horses, no cattle, no pigs, until Europeans brought them. This meant less animal protein, less milk and cheese, and crucially, no animals large enough to pull ploughs or power mills. Australia had even fewer domesticable plants and animals, which is why Aboriginal Australians remained hunter-gatherers rather than developing agriculture. These differences mattered for thousands of years. Agricultural societies could support larger populations, could develop cities, could free some people from food production to become craftspeople and merchants and soldiers and bureaucrats. They could develop writing to keep records, metallurgy to make tools and weapons, technologies that built on each other across generations. This doesn't mean agricultural societies were better. Hunter-gatherer societies often provided better nutrition, more leisure, more egalitarian social structures. But agricultural societies had advantages in organised violence and in resisting the diseases that came from living in close proximity to domesticated animals. By the time of European contact with the Americas in 1492, these differences had created enormous technological gaps. Europeans had guns, steel, ships capable of crossing oceans, written language, complex state organizations. Amerindians had cities and empires and sophisticated agriculture, but they didn't have these particular technologies. And Europeans, living for millennia with domesticated animals, had developed immunity to diseases like smallpox and measles that would devastate American populations who had no previous exposure. So geography, the distribution of domesticable plants and animals, the orientation of continents, the presence or absence of natural barriers, helped shape the distribution of technological advancement and eventually economic power. But this was the distant past. How does it connect to modern patterns of wealth and poverty? The answer is that early advantages or disadvantages created path dependencies, patterns that reinforce themselves over time. Societies that developed agriculture early developed technologies and institutions that allowed them to develop new technologies and institutions. Wealth enabled investment in education and infrastructure. Power enabled conquest and the extraction of resources from other regions. These patterns, once established, proved remarkably persistent. But they weren't permanent or unchangeable. Geography shaped possibilities, but what happened next depended on human choices, on institutions, on historical contingencies that we'll explore as we continue our journey through this question. Let that settle for a moment. Picture those two landscapes again, the Dutch lowlands with their rivers and harbours, and the Bolivian highlands, remote and isolated. Geography dealt different hands to different regions. Some places were gifted with natural harbours and navigable rivers and temperate climates and domesticable crops. Others faced mountains and disease and isolation. These differences mattered, shaped what was easy and what was hard, created tendencies toward different outcomes. But geography is only the first chapter of our story. The game that followed, the age of exploration, conquest and empire, reshuffled those hands in ways that echo into our present moment. Let's turn now to history, to how human actions over the past 5 centuries created patterns of wealth and poverty that geography alone cannot explain. Geography dealt different hands to different regions, as we've seen. Some places were gifted with natural harbours and navigable rivers and temperate climates. Others faced mountains and disease and isolation. These differences mattered, shaped what was easy and what was hard, created tendencies towards different outcomes. But geography is only the first chapter of our story. The game that followed, the age of exploration, conquest and empire, reshuffled those hands in ways that echo into our present moment. What happened over the past 5 centuries, through human choices and violence and accidents and institutions, often reversed the advantages that geography had created. Let's explore how colonization shaped the modern map of wealth and poverty. In the year 1400, before European ships ventured far from their home waters, the distribution of wealth and development across the world looked quite different from today. China was arguably the most advanced civilization, with sophisticated agriculture, extensive trade networks, impressive cities, technological innovations like gunpowder and the compass and printing. India produced textiles that were prized throughout the known world. The Islamic world stretched from Spain to Indonesia, with centres of learning and commerce in Baghdad and Cairo and Damascus. West African kingdoms controlled the gold trade. The Aztec and Inca empires built monumental architecture and governed millions of people. Europe, by contrast, was relatively poor and backward. It had recovered from the Black Death, but remained fragmented into small kingdoms constantly at war with each other. Its cities were smaller than those in China or India. Its technology was borrowed as much as invented. There was little to suggest that Europe would soon reshape the world, but Europe had several things working in its favour. Some of them accidental. It had horses and ships and guns and steel and resistance to old world diseases. It had competitive fragmentation, dozens of small states competing with each other, which created incentives for innovation and risk-taking that might not have existed in larger, more stable empires. And it had access to the Atlantic Ocean at a moment when oceanic navigation was becoming possible. When Christopher Columbus sailed west in 1492, searching for a route to Asia and stumbling instead onto the Americas, he initiated a process that would transform the world. The Columbian Exchange, the transfer of plants, animals, diseases, and people between the Old World and the New, was one of history's pivotal moments. Europeans brought wheat and horses and cattle and smallpox to the Americas. They took back corn and potatoes and tomatoes and tobacco. But they also initiated centuries of conquest, colonization, and extraction that would shape economic geography in lasting ways. The diseases Europeans carried, smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, diseases to which Europeans had developed some immunity over millennia of exposure, devastated American populations who had no previous contact and therefore no immunity. Estimates vary, but it's likely that 90% or more of the indigenous population of the Americas died in the century following contact. Entire civilizations collapsed. Cities were abandoned. Agricultural systems failed. This demographic catastrophe created a vacuum into which European colonizers moved, claiming land and establishing settlements and extracting resources. But here's where the story becomes complex. Because European colonizers didn't create the same kinds of colonies everywhere. The institutions they established, the rules about property and labor and governance, varied depending on local conditions, and these institutional differences created path dependencies that persist 500 years later. Economists Daron Acemoglu and James Robinson have documented a fascinating pattern. In places where Europeans settled in large numbers and intended to stay, places like North America, Australia, New Zealand, parts of South America like Argentina and Chile, they established what we might call quote 5. They created systems of property rights that protected settlers' land and assets. They built courts to enforce contracts. They eventually developed representative governments where settlers had political voice. These institutions encouraged investment and innovation because people knew their property would be protected, and they'd benefit from their own efforts. But in places where Europeans didn't settle in large numbers, either because the climate was unhealthy for them, or because there were already dense indigenous populations to exploit, they established very different institutions. These extractive institutions were designed to transfer wealth from the colony to the colonizing power as efficiently as possible. Property rights for the local population were weak or non-existent. Labour was coerced through slavery or other forms of forced labour. Political power was concentrated in colonial administrators who answered to distant capitals, not to local populations. What determined which kind of institutions Europeans established? A crucial factor was what Acemoglu and Robinson call settler mortality. How likely were European colonists to survive in a particular place? In temperate regions without tropical diseases, Massachusetts, Virginia, Australia, Europeans could settle and farm and build communities. Settler mortality was low. These places got inclusive institutions, at least for the European settlers, and eventually for others. But in tropical regions where malaria and yellow fever killed Europeans at frightening rates, West Africa, the Caribbean, much of Southeast Asia, Europeans didn't settle in large numbers. Instead, they established extractive institutions designed to pull out gold and silver and sugar and cotton and coffee, using enslaved or coerced local labour, with minimal European presence beyond soldiers and administrators. Settler mortality was high. These places got extractive institutions. Consider the Caribbean islands. The climate was unsuitable for Europeans, and diseases killed them rapidly. So Europeans established sugar plantations, imported millions of enslaved Africans to work those plantations and created systems designed purely for extraction. The plantation owners often didn't even live on the islands, instead managing them from afar and taking the profits back to Europe. Everything was organised to maximise sugar production and profits. Nothing was invested in education or infrastructure or institutions that might benefit the local population. Haiti provides a particularly stark example. As the French colony of Saint-Domingue, it was one of the world's most profitable colonies in the 18th century. It produced enormous quantities of sugar and coffee using enslaved labour under brutal conditions. The wealth flowed to France. Then, in 1791, enslaved people in Saint-Domingue rose in rebellion. The Haitian Revolution that followed was the only successful slave revolt in history that led to the establishment of an independent state. In 1804, Haiti became the second independent nation in the Americas after the United States. But Haiti's independence came at tremendous cost. The warfare devastated the plantation economy. France refused to recognize Haiti's independence unless Haiti paid massive reparations for the loss of _8, meaning the enslaved people who had freed themselves. This debt burdened Haiti for over a century. Other nations, fearing that successful slave rebellion would inspire similar revolts elsewhere, isolated Haiti diplomatically and economically. The extractive institutions that had been designed to produce sugar for export weren't suitable for building a self-sustaining economy. Haiti remained poor, and the legacy of colonization and its aftermath continues to shape the country's struggles today. Now contrast Haiti with North America. The English colonies that became the United States had very different origins. Europeans could survive the climate reasonably well. They came intending to settle, to farm, to build communities. Yes, there was tremendous violence against indigenous populations, dispossessing them of their land. Yes. Slavery existed in the southern colonies and played a crucial economic role. But the institutions established in these colonies were designed for settlers who planned to stay, not for distant extraction. Property rights were protected, at least for white male settlers. Representative assemblies gave colonists political voice. Courts enforced contracts. Over time, these institutions expanded to include more people and proved conducive to economic development. The pattern extends beyond the Americas. Consider India, which had a sophisticated economy when the British East India Company began establishing control in the 18th century. India exported textiles, cotton cloth, that were highly prized throughout the world. Indian weavers and spinners were skilled craftspeople. The textile industry employed millions and created substantial wealth. British colonization systematically destroyed this industry. Britain wanted India as a market for British-manufactured textiles, not as a competitor. The British imposed tariffs that made Indian textiles expensive in Britain, while allowing British textiles to enter India cheaply. They restructured the economy to produce raw cotton for export to British mills, rather than finished textiles. They destroyed looms and disrupted craft guilds. Indian weavers were sometimes mutilated to prevent them from practicing their craft. This process, called deindustrialization, transformed India from a manufacturing centre to a supplier of raw materials. By the mid-19th century, India was exporting raw cotton to Britain, where it was manufactured into cloth in the mills of Manchester and Lancashire, then sold back to India. The value addition happened in Britain. The profits accrued to British companies and investors. India's share of global manufacturing output, which had been approximately 23% in 1700, had fallen to less than 2% by 1900. This wasn't because Indians lost skills or became lazy. It was the result of deliberate colonial policy designed to benefit Britain at India's expense. The British justified this through ideas about racial superiority and the supposed backwardness of colonized peoples. They claimed to be bringing civilization and progress. In reality, They were extracting wealth and preventing the very development they claimed to foster. When India finally gained independence in 1947, it inherited an economy that had been deliberately structured to serve British interests, not Indian ones. Transforming this economy to serve India's development required decades of effort. In Africa, the colonial experience took yet another form. Before European colonization, Africa had diverse societies, kingdoms and empires, trading networks, agricultural systems, urban centres. But Africa was less well known to Europeans than Asia or the Americas, and large-scale colonization came later, primarily in the 19th century during what's called the Scramble for Africa. Between 1880 and 1914, European powers divided almost the entire African continent among themselves. They drew borders with stunning arbitrariness, often using straight lines on maps that bore no relationship to ethnic, linguistic, or geographic realities. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, where European nations negotiated their African territorial claims, was conducted without a single African representative present. It was a division of the continent as if it were a pie to be sliced among European powers. These borders created lasting problems. Ethnic groups were split across different colonies. Historical rivals were forced into the same colonial territories. Geographic units that made no economic sense became political entities. When African nations gained independence in the 1950s and 60s, they inherited these arbitrary borders, and changing them proved almost impossible. Wars and ethnic conflicts that plague Africa today often trace back to colonial boundary decisions made in European capitals over a century ago. Colonial extraction in Africa took various forms. In the Congo, King Leopold of Belgium established a personal colony where rubber extraction was enforced through horrifying violence. Villages were burned, hands were cut off, millions died. In southern Africa, gold and diamond mining created economies built on cheap African labour in dangerous conditions. In East Africa, plantation agriculture for coffee and tea used forced labour systems. Throughout the continent, colonial administrations extracted resources while investing minimally in education, infrastructure, or institutions that might benefit local populations. The justification was often a supposed civilizing mission, the idea that Europeans were bringing progress to backward peoples, but the reality was extraction and exploitation. Africans were prevented from owning land in their own countries, from accessing education, from participating in governance, from developing industries. When independence came, African nations inherited economies structured to export raw materials to Europe, weak institutions, borders that made little sense, and populations with limited education because colonial powers had deliberately restricted access to schooling. There's a pattern here worth dwelling on. The quote 10 that Acemoglu and Robinson documented shows that the regions that were most prosperous before European colonization often became the poorest afterward, while regions that were relatively empty or undeveloped became wealthier. Why? Because in already prosperous regions with dense populations, Europeans established extractive institutions to exploit existing wealth and labour. But in less developed regions where Europeans settled, they established inclusive institutions that fostered growth. This reversal is visible in many comparisons. The Mughals in India were wealthier than contemporary European kingdoms, but India under British rule became impoverished while Britain industrialised. The Aztec and Inca empires were rich and sophisticated, but Mexico and Peru remained relatively poor for centuries, while Argentina and Chile, where fewer indigenous people lived and Europeans settled in larger numbers, developed more successfully. Geography influenced where Europeans could settle. Temperate zones with low disease burden attracted settlers, while tropical zones with high mortality did not. But the crucial factor was institutions, and those institutions were shaped by colonization. Once established, institutions proved remarkably persistent. Countries don't easily transform extractive institutions into inclusive ones. The rules and norms and power structures that colonization created outlasted the colonial period itself. When decolonization came, mostly in the mid-20th century for Africa and Asia, earlier for Latin America, newly independent nations faced enormous challenges. They inherited economies designed to serve colonial masters, not local development. They inherited arbitrary borders. They inherited institutions that concentrated power and facilitated extraction. They often lacked people with education or administrative experience because colonial powers had deliberately limited access to these opportunities. They faced global economic systems still dominated by former colonizers. Some countries managed to transform themselves despite these challenges. We'll explore their stories later. But many struggled, trapped in patterns that colonization had established. Civil wars, coups, corruption, economic stagnation. These weren't inevitable outcomes of anything inherent to these regions or peoples. They were consequences of historical processes, of institutions and structures that colonization created. Understanding this history doesn't absolve current leaders of responsibility for their choices. Corruption is corruption. Violence is violence. Poor policy is poor policy. But it does help us see that the poverty of formerly colonized nations isn't mysterious or inexplicable. It's the predictable result of centuries of extraction and institutional development oriented toward exploitation rather than broad-based prosperity. There's something profoundly unjust about this legacy. People living today in poor countries didn't choose to be born into the aftermath of colonization. They're not responsible for institutions established centuries ago, yet they live with the consequences: weak governance, fragile states, economies dependent on raw material exports, insufficient infrastructure and education. Meanwhile, wealthy countries that benefited from colonization often fail to acknowledge this history or accept responsibility for addressing its ongoing effects. The question of reparations and historical justice is complex and beyond our scope tonight, but the basic fact is clear. Colonization created patterns of wealth and poverty that persist. History isn't past. It's present in institutions, in economic structures, in the distribution of power and resources across the globe. Let that settle. Think about those parallel stories: Haiti and the United States, India and Britain, the arbitrary borders drawn across Africa. Think about how institutions established centuries ago still shape possibilities today. History created structures that outlasted empires themselves. Colonial powers withdrew, but the institutions they built remained, shaping development for decades after independence. But structures can be changed, and some of the most interesting stories are about how. Some countries with terrible colonial legacies have managed remarkable transformations. Others with relatively advantageous starting points have struggled. The institutions matter more than the specific historical events, and institutions, while sticky and resistant to change, aren't permanent. First, though, let's understand what makes institutions powerful, how they shape behavior and outcomes, why some foster prosperity while others perpetuate poverty. That's where we'll turn next, to the rules of the game that determine who wins and who loses in the long struggle for development. History created structures that outlasted empires themselves. Colonial powers withdrew, but the institutions they built remained, shaping development for decades after independence. We've seen how geography and history shaped possibilities, but why do some countries with poor geography and difficult histories prosper, while others with advantages languish? The answer lies in something less visible, but more powerful than mountains or coastlines, something that shapes every economic transaction, every political decision, every investment and innovation. The answer lies in institutions, the rules of the game that determine how societies function. When economists talk about institutions, they don't mean buildings or organizations, though those can be part of it. They mean the formal and informal rules that structure human interaction. Property rights that determine who owns what and whether that ownership is secure. Courts that enforce contracts or fail to enforce them. Laws that protect investors or allow their assets to be seized arbitrarily. Political systems that give citizens voice or concentrate power in narrow elites. Customs and norms about corruption, about trust, about cooperation. These are institutions, and they're invisible but omnipresent, shaping every choice people make. Think about something as simple as starting a business. In some countries, you can register a business online in a few hours. The process is transparent, the fees are clear, the rules are predictable. You know that if you succeed, you'll keep the profits. You know that contracts you sign will be enforceable in courts. You know that some competitor with political connections can't shut you down on a whim. These institutional features make starting a business attractive. People do it. Innovation happens. The economy grows. In other countries, starting a business might require navigating a bureaucratic maze, dozens of permits from different agencies, each requiring fees and waiting periods. Officials might demand bribes at each step, even after you start. You might face constant harassment from inspectors looking for violations of obscure regulations. Your politically connected competitor might use government power to shut you down. Or worse, if your business succeeds, someone powerful might simply take it from you, and you'll have no legal recourse. These institutional features make starting a business unattractive and risky. People keep their savings hidden. They avoid formal economic activity. Innovation stagnates. The economy remains poor. The economist Douglas North spent his career studying institutions and their economic effects. He argued that institutions are the fundamental cause of economic performance. Good institutions reduce what economists call transaction costs, the costs of doing business, of enforcing agreements, of protecting property. When transaction costs are low, trade expands, specialization deepens, productivity rises. When transaction costs are high, people retreat into self-sufficiency and small-scale informal activity. They don't trust strangers enough to trade with them. They don't invest because returns are too uncertain. The economy stagnates. Property rights are perhaps the most fundamental institution. If you plant crops in a field, will you be able to harvest them, or might someone take them? If you build a house, will you own it, or could it be confiscated? If you save money, will it hold its value, or might inflation or currency controls or arbitrary seizure destroy it? These questions determine whether people will make long-term investments, whether they'll improve land, whether they'll accumulate capital. Consider a farmer deciding whether to invest in irrigation. Irrigation is expensive. It requires digging channels, buying or building pumps, installing pipes. But it can dramatically increase yields, allowing multiple harvests per year instead of one, protecting against drought, enabling higher value crops. A farmer will only make this investment if she's confident she'll be able to capture the returns. If property rights are secure, if she knows the land is hers and can't be arbitrarily taken, she'll invest in irrigation. If property rights are insecure, if powerful people can seize productive land, she'll make do with rain-fed agriculture and accept lower yields. Multiply this decision across millions of farmers and businesses and investors, and you see how property rights shape economic development. Secure property rights encourage investment and improvement. Insecure property rights lead to stagnation. The rule of law matters too. Will disputes be resolved fairly in courts? Or does justice depend on wealth and connections? Can businesses rely on contracts being enforced? Or do they need personal relationships and trust? When the rule of law is strong, strangers can do business together. Markets expand beyond local communities. Complex transactions become possible because legal mechanisms exist to resolve disputes and punish fraud. When the rule of law is weak, trust becomes essential, and trust doesn't scale. You can trust family, maybe close friends, perhaps members of your ethnic or religious community. But you can't build a large economy on personal trust alone. You need impersonal institutions, courts that enforce contracts regardless of who the parties are, police that protect property regardless of who owns it, regulations that apply equally to everyone. Let's think about corruption, because it's both a symptom and a cause of weak institutions. Corruption happens when public officials use their positions for private gain, taking bribes, demanding kickbacks, steering contracts to relatives, embezzling public funds. In countries with weak institutions, corruption is often endemic, touching every interaction with government. But we should understand corruption not just as moral failing, but as rational response to certain institutional arrangements. If you're a police officer paid $20 a month, barely enough to survive, and you have the power to extract bribes from motorists or merchants, what do? If refusing bribes means your family goes hungry, while your colleagues who accept bribes prosper, the choice becomes difficult. If everyone around you is corrupt, if it's expected and normalized, if honest officials are seen as foolish rather than virtuous, then corruption becomes the rational strategy. Or consider a business owner facing customs officials who can delay shipments indefinitely, ostensibly to check for violations. These delays cost money. Perishable goods spoil, contracts are breached, customers go elsewhere. If a bribe of $100 can move your shipment through in hours rather than weeks, you'll probably pay it. You might hate the corruption, might think it's unjust, but you'll participate because the alternative is worse. This creates a vicious cycle. Corruption raises the cost of doing business, which reduces economic activity, which means less tax revenue, which means government can't pay officials adequate salaries, which increases incentives for corruption. Meanwhile, corruption undermines trust in government, making citizens unwilling to pay taxes, which further reduces state capacity, which increases corruption. Breaking this cycle is extraordinarily difficult. Acemoglu and Robinson, whose work we mentioned earlier, distinguish between inclusive and extractive institutions. Inclusive institutions are those that create broad-based opportunity, secure property rights for everyone, not just elites, rule of law that applies to powerful and weak alike, political systems where citizens have voice, economic freedom to enter markets and compete. Extractive institutions are those that concentrate power and wealth in narrow groups, property rights that protect elites but not ordinary people, rule of law that bends to the powerful, political systems that exclude most people from decision-making, economic monopolies and barriers that prevent competition. Inclusive institutions encourage investment and innovation because people know they'll benefit from their efforts. They encourage productivity because rewards flow to those who create value. They're self-reinforcing. Broad-based prosperity creates political constituencies that defend inclusive institutions, but they're also hard to establish because they require elites to give up power and privilege. Extractive institutions, by contrast, allow elites to capture wealth without creating value. They discourage innovation because new technologies or businesses might threaten existing power structures. They're also self-reinforcing. The wealth extracted allows elites to maintain political control, which they use to preserve extractive institutions. But they limit economic growth because most people lack incentives to invest or innovate. The challenge of development is largely the challenge of transforming extractive institutions into inclusive ones. This is difficult because those who benefit from extractive institutions, who control them, have every incentive to resist change. They'll use their wealth to buy political support. They'll use their political power to protect their wealth. They'll argue that stability requires maintaining current arrangements, that reform is dangerous, that critics are radicals or foreign agents. Some countries have managed this transformation. Let's consider Botswana because it's one of Africa's most remarkable success stories, and it demonstrates how institutions matter more than geography or history or resource endowments. Botswana is landlocked in southern Africa. At independence in 1966, it was one of the world's poorest countries. It had a tiny population, about 500,000 people, scattered across a largely arid landscape. It had minimal infrastructure, minimal education, minimal industry. Its prospects looked bleak, but Botswana had something crucial. Leadership committed to building inclusive institutions. Seretse Khama, its first president, and his successors established democratic governance, maintained rule of law, protected property rights, invested in education and infrastructure. When diamonds were discovered shortly after independence, Botswana negotiated contracts that ensured substantial revenues went to the government rather than to foreign mining companies. And crucially, those revenues were invested in public goods rather than stolen by elites. Botswana has held regular free elections since independence. Power has transferred peacefully between political parties. Corruption exists but is far lower than in most African countries. The courts function reasonably well. Property rights are secure. The civil service is relatively competent and honest. These institutions created an environment where investment made sense, where businesses could form and grow, where education paid off. The results have been extraordinary. Between 1966 and 2000, Botswana had the fastest growing economy in the world. Per capita income rose from around $200 at independence to over $9,000 by the early 2000s. Life expectancy increased. Literacy rates soared. Infrastructure was built. Botswana avoided the civil wars and coups and economic collapses that plagued many African countries. This wasn't because Botswana had better geography than its neighbours. Zimbabwe and South Africa and Namibia have similar or better geographic endowments. It wasn't because of resources. Botswana has diamonds, but many resource-rich countries remain poor. It was because of institutions. Botswana built inclusive institutions that created incentives for productive activity and protected the gains from arbitrary seizure. Now contrast Botswana with Zimbabwe, its neighbour. Zimbabwe at independence in 1980 had better infrastructure, more industry, better education than Botswana had in 1966. It had fertile agricultural land that made it the breadbasket of southern Africa. But Zimbabwe's leadership under Robert Mugabe increasingly concentrated power, undermined institutions and pursued policies that enriched elites while impoverishing the country. Land reform in the early 2000s seized productive commercial farms and redistributed them, often to politically connected individuals without farming experience. Production collapsed. Property rights were destroyed. If the government could seize farms, what property was safe? The rule of law eroded as courts were packed with loyalists. Opposition politicians were harassed and arrested. Elections were manipulated. Economic policy became incoherent, driven by short-term political needs rather than long-term development. The results were catastrophic. Zimbabwe's economy shrank by more than half. Hyperinflation reached levels rarely seen in history, prices doubling every day at the peak. Unemployment reached 80 or 90%. Millions fled to South Africa and Botswana and beyond. A country that had been prosperous in the 1980s became desperately poor. This wasn't inevitable. Zimbabwe and Botswana had similar starting points, both landlocked, both resource-endowed, both formerly colonized. The difference was institutions. Botswana built inclusive institutions. Zimbabwe maintained and worsened extractive ones. The outcomes followed predictably. Perhaps the starkest institutional comparison is between North and South Korea. Here we have the same people, Koreans, on the same peninsula, with similar geography and climate, with shared history and culture going back thousands of years. They were divided in 1945 at the end of World War II, with North Korea falling into the Soviet sphere and South Korea into the American sphere. What happened next is one of history's clearest natural experiments in institutions. North Korea built a totalitarian communist system with extreme concentration of power. The state owned all property. Markets were abolished. Political control was absolute. The Kim family cult of personality became the organizing principle of society. Individual initiative was crushed. information was controlled. Citizens couldn't travel freely or choose their occupations. Everything was directed from the top. South Korea, after a rocky start with military dictatorships, eventually developed democratic institutions with market economics. Property rights were protected, markets were allowed to function. People could start businesses, invest, innovate. Education was emphasized. The country opened to international trade. Political freedoms gradually expanded. By 2020, the results were stark. South Korea's per capita income was around $31,000. North Korea's was estimated at around $1,800, roughly 1/17 of South Korea's. South Korea was a global leader in technology, manufacturing advanced semiconductors and smartphones and automobiles. North Korea struggled to feed its population and occasionally experienced famines. South Korea was integrated into the global economy. North Korea was isolated and impoverished. Same people, same geography. The difference was entirely institutional. The rules governing economic and political life determined outcomes. North Korea's extractive institutions prevented development. South Korea's increasingly inclusive institutions fostered it. Singapore offers another institutional story, different but equally instructive. When Singapore became independent in 1965 after being expelled from Malaysia, its prospects seemed poor. It was a tiny city-state without natural resources, without even enough fresh water, densely populated, ethnically diverse in ways that created potential conflict. Many observers predicted failure. But Singapore's leadership, particularly Lee Kuan Yew, focused obsessively on building effective institutions. They created a civil service selected by merit and paid well enough to reduce corruption. They established rule of law with courts that were effective and relatively impartial. They protected property rights and welcomed foreign investment. They invested heavily in education. They maintained political stability through somewhat authoritarian means, but avoided the extreme repression that characterizes truly extractive regimes. Singapore also adapted institutions to local context rather than simply copying Western models. They emphasized meritocracy and pragmatism over ideology. They built public housing that created stakes in stability for most citizens. They managed ethnic diversity through careful policies. They created institutional mechanisms suited to Singapore's specific circumstances. The results transformed a poor port city into one of the world's wealthiest nations. Singapore's per capita income exceeds that of most Western countries. Its port is among the world's busiest. Its financial sector is a global hub. Its education system consistently ranks at the top internationally. This happened through institutional design, creating rules and organizations that channeled human effort toward productive ends. These examples, Botswana and Zimbabwe, North and South Korea, Singapore, illustrate that institutions matter more than geography or resources or culture. They show that countries can transform themselves through institutional change, but they also reveal how difficult institutional change is. Botswana succeeded partly through good fortune in leadership at the critical moment of independence. South Korea's transformation required decades and happened partly through external pressure. Singapore had unusual circumstances, a small, manageable population, and an existential crisis that created political unity. Most countries face much harder challenges. Entrenched elites resist changes that would reduce their power. Ethnic or religious divisions make it hard to build shared institutions. Colonial legacies created borders and power structures that undermine effective governance. Poverty itself makes institutional improvement difficult. When most people are focused on daily survival, organizing for political change is nearly impossible. There's also the question of whether institutions can be transplanted, or whether they must grow organically from local circumstances. Western countries often push developing nations to adopt democratic institutions, market economies, independent courts. Sometimes this works, often it doesn't. Institutions that function well in one context may fail in another. Democracy requires certain preconditions: literacy, rule of law, shared national identity, mechanisms to resolve disputes peacefully. Imposing democratic forms on societies that lack these preconditions often produces only the appearance of democracy, while power remains concentrated in traditional elites or military factions. Markets too require institutional foundations. You can't just eliminate state control and expect markets to function. You need property rights, contract enforcement, regulations to prevent fraud and monopoly, financial institutions to allocate capital, education systems to create skilled workers. Russia's attempt to transition from communism to capitalism in the 1990s failed partly because institutions weren't built to support markets. Instead, well-connected insiders grabbed state assets. Becoming oligarchs, markets without proper institutions produce corruption and chaos rather than prosperity. The lesson isn't that institutions don't matter, or that Western institutions are wrong. The lesson is that institutions must fit contexts, that they develop over time through complex processes, that they can't simply be imposed from outside. Development requires building state capacity, the ability to collect taxes, enforce laws, provide services, maintain order, before or alongside democratic reforms. It requires adapting universal principles to local circumstances. It requires patience and understanding that institutional change is measured in decades, not years. Let that settle. Think about those contrasts: Botswana and Zimbabwe, North and South Korea, the difference that rules and governance make. Institutions are invisible structures that shape everything. They determine whether hard work pays off or gets stolen. They determine whether businesses can flourish or only survive through corruption. They determine whether societies can cooperate or fracture into conflict. Geography and history create starting points, but institutions determine destinations. Building good institutions is hard, perhaps the hardest challenge of development, but it's also the most important. Countries with good institutions can overcome geographic disadvantages and historical burdens. Countries with bad institutions squander natural gifts and historical advantages. The rules of the game matter more than the hand you're dealt. And changing those rules, transforming extractive institutions into inclusive ones, remains the central challenge facing poor countries. But institutions provide the rules of the game. The players in the game, their skills, their health, their knowledge matter too. That's where we turn next, to human capital, to how education and health shape development, to why investing in people may be the most important investment countries can make. Institutions provide the rules of the game, as we've seen. They determine whether hard work pays off or gets stolen, whether businesses can flourish or only survive through corruption. Geography and history create starting points, but institutions determine possibilities. Yet even the best institutions can't create prosperity from nothing. The players in the game matter too: their skills, their health, their knowledge, their ability to cooperate. A country's wealth ultimately comes from its people, from what economists call human capital. Let's explore how education and health shape national destinies, how investing in people can break cycles of poverty, and why human development may be the most important factor of all. Think about what happens when a child goes to school. On the surface, it seems simple. They learn to read and write, to calculate, to understand the world. But education does something more profound. It transforms human potential into human capability. A child who can read can learn from books. A child who can calculate can understand commerce and finance. A child who understands biology and chemistry can become a doctor or engineer. Education multiplies what a person can contribute to society and what they can earn for themselves. Gary Becker, an economist who won the Nobel Prize for his work on human capital, showed that investing in education generates returns comparable to investing in physical capital like machines or buildings. When a society educates its children, those children become more productive adults. They earn higher incomes, They pay more taxes, they innovate and create new businesses, they're healthier and live longer, they raise educated children of their own, the returns compound across generations. Consider South Korea's transformation, because it's one of history's most dramatic examples of education driving development. In 1950, after the Korean War devastated the peninsula, South Korea was desperately poor. Its per capita income was roughly $100 per year, lower than many African countries at the time. Most of the population was illiterate. The country had minimal industry, minimal infrastructure, minimal prospects. But South Korean leadership made a fateful decision. They would invest heavily in education. Even when the country was still very poor, when resources were scarce, they built schools, they trained teachers, they made primary education universal, then expanded secondary education, then built universities. They emphasized math and science and technical skills. They created a culture that valued education intensely, where families sacrificed to ensure their children could study. The results took decades to fully materialize, but they were extraordinary. By the 1980s, South Korea had near universal literacy. By the 2000s, it had among the world's highest rates of university attendance. And this educated population drove an economic miracle. South Korea transformed from agricultural poverty to industrial powerhouse to technological leader. It now produces semiconductors and smartphones and automobiles and ships that compete globally. Its per capita income is around $35,000, comparable to many European countries. This didn't happen through natural resources. South Korea has few. It didn't happen through favourable geography. The country is mountainous with limited arable land. It happened through human capital. An educated population could work in factories efficiently, could absorb new technologies, could eventually innovate and create new technologies. Education was the foundation of everything else. East Asia more broadly followed this pattern. Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong. These places invested heavily in education during their development. They created skilled workforces that could handle increasingly sophisticated manufacturing and eventually services and technology. They broke the cycle where poverty prevents education and lack of education perpetuates poverty. But education's benefits extend beyond economic growth. Educated people make different choices about family size, about health, about civic participation. There's a strong correlation between women's education and fertility rates. When girls attend school, when they have options beyond early marriage and childbearing, they tend to have fewer children and to have them later. This matters enormously for development. The demographic transition, the shift from high birth rates and high death rates to low birth rates and low death rates, is one of development's crucial processes. In pre-modern societies, families had many children because child mortality was high, and children were needed for labour. As societies develop, mortality falls, but fertility often remains high for a generation, creating rapid population growth. Eventually, fertility falls too, population growth slows, and the age structure shifts. East Asian countries captured what's called the demographic dividend. As fertility fell, these countries experienced a generation where the working age population was large relative to children and elderly dependents. This meant more workers and fewer dependents, which allowed higher savings, higher investment, faster growth. But this dividend doesn't happen automatically. It requires that the working age population be educated and healthy and employed. East Asia managed this, many other regions haven't. Sub-Saharan Africa is still early in the demographic transition. Fertility rates have fallen but remain high, 4 or 5 children per woman in many countries compared to 1 or 2 in developed countries. The population is young and growing rapidly. This could be an opportunity, a large young workforce, but only if these young people are educated and healthy and can find productive employment. If they're not, rapid population growth strains resources and creates instability. Education, particularly female education, is key to managing this transition. When women are educated, they enter the workforce, they have more power in household decisions, they invest more in each child's education and health, rather than having many children with less investment in each. This creates a virtuous cycle where smaller families mean more resources per child, which means better education and health, which means higher productivity and incomes. Let's think about health, because it's as fundamental as education. A population weakened by disease cannot be productive. Malaria, which we discussed earlier as a geographic factor, isn't just about where you can grow crops. It's about human energy and capability. A child with chronic malaria misses school, develops more slowly, has reduced cognitive function. An adult with malaria can't work effectively, earns less, produces less. Multiply this across millions of people and entire economies are diminished. The eradication or control of major diseases has been crucial to development. When malaria was controlled in parts of southern Europe and the American South in the mid-20th century through draining swamps and using pesticides, those regions experienced economic booms. When smallpox was eradicated globally through a coordinated vaccination campaign completed in 1980, humanity eliminated a disease that had killed and disabled millions. When oral rehydration therapy, a simple mixture of water, salt, and sugar, was widely adopted to treat diarrheal diseases in children, it saved millions of lives at minimal cost. Clean water and sanitation infrastructure matter immensely. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery. These waterborne diseases killed and debilitated populations throughout history. Building sewage systems and water treatment plants is unglamorous but transformative. Victorian Britain's life expectancy increased dramatically in the late 19th century, not primarily because of medical advances, but because of public health infrastructure, sewers and clean water and regulations about food safety. Kerala, a state in southern India, provides an interesting case. Kerala isn't wealthy by global standards. Its per capita income is a few $1,000s, comparable to other Indian states. But its health and education outcomes rival much wealthier countries. Life expectancy in Kerala is around 75 years, comparable to the United States. Infant mortality is low, literacy is nearly universal, and female literacy equals male literacy, which is rare in South Asia. How did Kerala achieve this? Through deliberate investment in health and education even when income was low. The state government built schools and made education free and compulsory. They built health clinics and trained healthcare workers. They empowered local governments to deliver services. They emphasized women's education and political participation. The result is a population that's healthy and educated despite modest economic development. And this human capital is now driving economic growth as Kerala develops. The contrast with other Indian states is instructive. States like Bihar or Uttar Pradesh have lower literacy, lower life expectancy, higher infant mortality despite sometimes having higher incomes. The difference is investment in human capital. Kerala shows that countries don't need to wait until they're rich to invest in education and health. In fact, investing in education and health helps countries become rich. But there's a challenge that educated populations in poor countries face: the temptation to leave. Brain drain, the emigration of educated people from poor countries to rich ones, represents a loss of human capital that poor countries can ill afford. When a doctor or engineer or scientist trained at public expense in Ghana or the Philippines or India emigrates to the United States or Britain or Australia, the sending country loses the investment it made in that person's education and loses the contribution they would have made to development. The numbers are substantial. A large proportion of African-born doctors work outside Africa, mostly in wealthy countries. Engineers and scientists from India, China, Latin America emigrate in large numbers. From the individual's perspective, this makes sense. They can earn far more in wealthy countries, provide better opportunities for their children, work with better resources and infrastructure. But from the sending country's perspective, it's devastating. However, the picture is more complex than simple loss. Diaspora communities often maintain connections to their home countries. They send remittances, money sent home to family members, and these remittances are enormous. For some countries, remittances exceed foreign aid and foreign investment combined. The Philippines, Mexico, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan. These countries receive tens of billions of dollars annually in remittances from their diasporas. Diaspora members also invest in their home countries, starting businesses or buying property. They transfer knowledge and technology. They create networks that facilitate trade and investment. Indian engineers who worked in Silicon Valley returned to help build India's information technology industry in Bangalore and Hyderabad. Chinese scientists and entrepreneurs who studied abroad returned to help develop China's technology sector. Taiwan's semiconductor industry was built partly by engineers who had worked in the United States and brought back expertise. This suggests that the relationship between emigration and development isn't simply negative. If diaspora members maintain connections, if some return with skills and capital, if remittances are invested productively, emigration can benefit sending countries. But this requires creating conditions attractive enough to entice return and investment, which brings us back to institutions and opportunities. Let's consider social capital, a concept that's harder to measure than education or health, but may be equally important. Social capital refers to networks of relationships, norms of trust and reciprocity, ability to cooperate for common goals. Societies with high social capital can solve collective action problems more easily, can build institutions more effectively, can achieve higher levels of development. Robert Putnam studied social capital in Italy and found striking differences between northern and southern regions. Northern Italy had traditions of civic engagement, voluntary associations, networks of cooperation going back centuries. Southern Italy had weaker civic traditions, stronger hierarchies, lower trust outside family networks. These differences correlated with economic development. Northern Italy was wealthier and had better functioning governments than southern Italy. Putnam argued that social capital, accumulated over centuries, explained much of this difference. Trust enables economic transactions. When people trust each other, they can do business without extensive legal contracts or enforcement mechanisms. They can form partnerships, extend credit, make deals with handshakes. When trust is low, every transaction requires legal protection, which is costly and slow. Markets work better in high-trust societies. Trust also enables collective action for public goods. Building and maintaining irrigation systems requires farmers to cooperate. Keeping village commons from being overgrazed requires restraint and monitoring. Maintaining law and order requires citizens to respect rules even when they're not being watched. Societies with high trust can achieve these cooperative outcomes more easily. Scandinavian countries exemplify high-trust societies. Surveys consistently show that people in Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Finland trust each other and trust their governments at rates far higher than global averages. This trust enables extensive welfare states. People accept high taxes because they trust the money will be used well and that others aren't cheating the system. It enables business formation and innovation. People can take risks knowing there's a safety net. It enables political stability. Disputes are resolved through democratic processes because people trust the system. Building social capital is difficult and slow. It depends on shared experiences, on institutions that treat people fairly, on norms that develop over generations. Countries can't simply import social capital the way they can import machinery, but they can create conditions that foster it. Rule of law that applies equally to everyone, transparency in government, education that brings different groups together, economic growth that's broadly shared. Gender equality represents both a moral imperative and an economic opportunity. When half the population faces discrimination, when women can't access education or own property or work in many occupations, a country is wasting enormous human potential. The correlation between gender equality and economic development is strong and likely causal in both directions. Development enables greater equality, and equality fosters development. Women's education has particularly high returns. Educated women have healthier children, and those children are more likely to attend school. Educated women participate in the workforce, doubling the available human capital. Educated women engage in civic life and politics, bringing different perspectives and priorities. Studies consistently show that development programs targeting women often have better outcomes than those targeting men, partly because women are more likely to invest resources in children's health and education. Microfinance, small loans to poor people, particularly women, to start businesses, emerge partly from recognition that women could be effective entrepreneurs despite lacking access to conventional banking. Muhammad Yunus won the Nobel Peace Prize for developing the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh, which made small loans to poor women to buy sewing machines or livestock or other productive assets. The repayment rates were high, and the impacts on family welfare were substantial. But microfinance also revealed limitations of individual-level interventions. Giving women small loans helps those individual women, but doesn't transform underlying structures of inequality. Women still face discrimination in property rights, in inheritance, in legal standing, in social norms. Addressing these deeper institutional factors requires political and legal change, not just economic empowerment. Countries that have achieved high levels of gender equality have done so through conscious policy choices. Finland, Iceland, Norway. These countries have implemented policies supporting parental leave, childcare, pay equity, political representation. They've challenged traditional gender roles and created opportunities for women in all fields. The result is higher women's labour force participation, better education outcomes, stronger economies. Conversely, countries that restrict women's opportunities handicap their own development. When women can't drive, as was true in Saudi Arabia until recently, half the population can't access many jobs or activities independently. When women can't inherit property or control their own earnings, they can't accumulate capital or make economic decisions. When women can't attend school, their potential is wasted and the next generation starts with disadvantages. The evidence is overwhelming. Investing in human capital, in education, in health, in women's empowerment, in social trust generates enormous returns. Countries that have developed successfully have invariably invested heavily in their people. Countries that remain poor have often neglected human capital, focusing instead on physical infrastructure or resource extraction or other priorities. But human capital alone isn't sufficient. Educated, healthy people need opportunities to use their talents. They need functioning economies with jobs to fill. They need to connect to markets where they can sell goods and services. They need technologies that multiply their efforts. Even the most educated population can't prosper in isolation. This brings us to how countries connect to each other, to trade and globalization, to the flows of goods and capital and ideas that link the modern world. That's where we turn next. Educated, healthy people need opportunities to use their talents, as we've explored. They need functioning economies with jobs and markets and possibilities. Even the most skilled population can't prosper in isolation. No country produces everything it needs or could benefit from. Trade, the exchange of goods and services across borders, has shaped human civilization for thousands of years. But in the modern era, trade has become something more profound, a mechanism that can lift countries from poverty or lock them into dependent relationships, that creates winners and losers, that connects distant places in intricate webs of production and consumption. Let's explore how countries connect to each other through trade, how exchange across borders can build wealth or entrench inequality, and why thinking carefully about trade is essential to understanding global patterns of prosperity. Begin with a simple idea, elegantly stated by the economist David Ricardo in the early 1800s. Ricardo asked. Why do countries trade with each other? The obvious answer is that countries have different resources. Brazil has coffee and Colombia has emeralds, and Saudi Arabia has oil, so they trade these things they have for things they lack. But Ricardo showed that trade makes sense even when one country is better at producing everything than another country. Imagine two countries, Portugal and England. Portugal, in Ricardo's example, can produce both wine and cloth more efficiently than England. Portugal has better climate for grapes, more skilled weavers, superior techniques for both products. You might think England shouldn't trade with Portugal because Portugal can make everything better and cheaper. But Ricardo demonstrated that both countries still benefit from trade if they specialise in what they're relatively best at producing. Portugal might be better than England at both wine and cloth, but suppose Portugal is much better at wine and only slightly better at cloth. Meanwhile, England is worse at both, but less worse at cloth than at wine. If Portugal specialises in wine and England specialises in cloth, and they trade wine for cloth, both end up with more of both goods than if each tried to make everything themselves. This is the principle of comparative advantage, and it's one of economics' most profound insights. The mathematics work out elegantly. Each country focuses on what it does relatively best, even if it's not absolutely best. Total production increases. Trade allows both to consume more than either could produce alone. Everyone gains from specialization and exchange. This theory has shaped how economists think about trade for 2 centuries. It explains why trade can be mutually beneficial even between very unequal partners. A wealthy, technologically advanced country can still gain from trading with a poor, technologically backward country if each specializes appropriately. The theory suggests that barriers to trade, tariffs, quotas, restrictions, make everyone poorer by preventing beneficial specialization. But we need to be careful, because the real world is more complicated than Ricardo's elegant models. Comparative advantage assumes that workers displaced from one industry can easily move to another, that countries can shift production smoothly, that the gains from trade are distributed fairly within countries. These assumptions often don't hold. Consider how trade shaped East Asia's economic miracles. Japan, starting in the late 1800s, and later South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and eventually China, pursued what economists call export-led growth. The strategy was to focus on producing manufactured goods for export to wealthy countries, particularly the United States and Europe. Start with simple products, textiles, basic electronics, toys, where low wages give competitive advantage. Use export revenues to import technology and capital goods. Gradually move up the value chain to more sophisticated products. Reinvest profits in education and infrastructure. Keep moving to higher and higher value production. Japan pioneered this path. In the 1950s and 60s, made in Japan meant cheap, low-quality goods. Japanese companies copied Western products and sold them cheaply, but they continuously improved quality, invested in technology, developed their own innovations. By the 1980s, Japanese cars and electronics were among the world's best. Sony, Toyota, Honda, Panasonic. These became global brands synonymous with quality. South Korea followed a similar trajectory a generation later. In the 1960s, South Korea exported wigs and textiles. By the 1980s, it was exporting ships and steel and semiconductors. By the 2000s, Samsung and LG and Hyundai competed at the technological frontier. The strategy worked. South Korea transformed from poverty to prosperity in a single generation. China's rise since the 1980s represents the most dramatic example. When China began opening to trade under Deng Xiaoping, it was desperately poor, with per capita income around $200. China became the world's factory, producing everything from toys to furniture to electronics. Hundreds of millions of Chinese workers moved from rural agriculture to urban manufacturing. Wages were low initially, giving China competitive advantage in labor-intensive production. But as workers gained skills and China invested in infrastructure and technology, production became more sophisticated. By 2020, China was producing advanced electronics, high-speed trains, telecommunications equipment, renewable energy technology. It had moved from simple assembly to complex manufacturing to increasingly sophisticated design and innovation. Trade had been the engine. Exporting to world markets provided the revenues and incentives to develop, while importing technology and ideas facilitated learning. The _13_ model describes this pattern. Japan was the lead goose, developing industries first. As Japan's wages rose and it moved to higher value production, labour-intensive industries shifted to the next tier: South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore. As these countries developed and their wages rose, industries shifted again to Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, and eventually to China and Vietnam and Bangladesh. Each country follows the same path, moving from agriculture to light manufacturing to heavy industry to technology and services. This model shows trade as beneficial and progressive. Countries use trade to develop, to learn, to accumulate capital and knowledge. They move up value chains, raising incomes and living standards. Everyone can win. Wealthy countries get cheaper goods, while poor countries get development opportunities. Trade becomes the escalator lifting countries from poverty to prosperity. But the experience of many countries, particularly in Latin America and Africa, suggests trade can also perpetuate inequality. Consider the concept of commodity dependence. Many poor countries rely heavily on exporting raw materials, oil, minerals, agricultural products, while importing manufactured goods. Venezuela exports oil, Zambia exports copper, Ghana exports cocoa. These countries are trapped in patterns established during colonization, when their economies were structured to supply raw materials to industrial powers. The problem is that commodity prices fluctuate dramatically while remaining relatively low over the long term. When copper prices rise, Zambia enjoys boom times. When they fall, the economy crashes. This volatility makes planning impossible, discourages long-term investment, creates cycles of boom and bust. Meanwhile, manufactured goods maintain value better and create more opportunities for productivity growth and technological development. The terms of trade, the ratio of export prices to import prices, often moves against commodity exporters over time. A ton of copper or coffee or cotton buys fewer manufactured goods today than it did 50 years ago. This isn't inevitable or natural. It's partly because industrial countries protect their agriculture, while demanding that poor countries open their markets. It's partly because manufacturing creates learning effects and productivity gains that primary production doesn't. It's partly because industrial countries have more power in setting rules of global trade. Raúl Prebisch, an Argentine economist, argued in the mid-20th century that free trade between industrial and commodity exporting countries would perpetuate underdevelopment. He advocated import substitution industrialization, protecting domestic industries behind tariff walls, developing manufacturing capability before opening to trade. Many Latin American countries followed this strategy in the 1950s through 70s. The results were mixed. Some countries developed domestic industries, reduced dependence on imports, built technological capacity. But protected industries often became inefficient, producing low-quality goods at high prices. Without competition, they had little incentive to improve. Corruption flourished as companies sought protection from politicians. Consumers paid higher prices for inferior goods. By the 1980s, most countries pursuing import substitution faced crisis: high inflation, foreign debt, stagnant growth. The debate between trade openness and protection continues. East Asian countries succeeded with export orientation, but they also protected key industries strategically, invested in education and infrastructure, and guided industrial development. They didn't simply open their markets and let free trade work its magic. They managed trade strategically, opening sectors gradually, supporting exports while protecting learning industries. Today's global economy features complex value chains that stretch across multiple countries. An iPhone is designed in California with components from dozens of countries, chips from Taiwan, screens from South Korea, assembly in China, rare earth elements from Congo, then sold worldwide. No single country makes an iPhone. It's a global product, and this pattern extends to cars and computers and appliances and countless other goods. These global value chains create interdependence. Countries specialize in particular stages of production: design, component manufacturing, assembly, distribution. This can be efficient, allowing each country to focus on what it does well. But it also creates vulnerabilities. Disruptions in one country ripple globally, as we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic when supply chains broke down. Value chains also raise questions about who captures value. Chinese workers assembling iPhones earn modest wages. Most of the profit goes to Apple for design and branding. The value added by assembly is small compared to the value from intellectual property and marketing. This suggests that countries should aspire not just to participate in value chains, but to capture the high-value activities: design, research, branding, sophisticated manufacturing. Free trade agreements, NAFTA between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, the European Union single market, various regional agreements across Asia and Africa, attempt to facilitate trade by reducing tariffs and harmonizing regulations. These agreements create larger markets, allow greater specialization, increase competition. They often boost overall economic growth. But trade agreements also create winners and losers within countries. When NAFTA was implemented in 1994, Mexican farmers faced competition from subsidized American corn. Many couldn't compete and left agriculture. American manufacturing workers faced competition from lower-wage Mexican workers. Some factories moved to Mexico. The gains from trade, cheaper goods for consumers, larger markets for competitive industries, were real but diffuse. The losses, lost jobs, closed factories, disrupted communities, were concentrated and visible. This creates political backlash against trade. Workers who lose jobs to foreign competition understandably resent trade agreements. Communities built around manufacturing that moves overseas face economic devastation. The argument that trade makes everyone better off in aggregate rings hollow to people whose lives are disrupted. Even if compensation programs could theoretically address this, retraining workers, supporting communities, such programs are often inadequate or non-existent. Trade's effects on inequality within countries are complex. Trade can reduce inequality by creating jobs in poor countries. Chinese workers who moved from rural poverty to urban factory jobs saw dramatic income gains. But trade can also increase inequality by rewarding skills and capital while penalizing less skilled labor. In wealthy countries, trade often benefits highly educated workers who can compete globally, while hurting less educated workers who face wage competition from abroad. The ethical questions are difficult. Should wealthy countries restrict trade to protect their workers, even if this keeps poor countries poor? Should poor countries accept their position in global value chains, even if it means remaining dependent on wealthy countries for technology and markets? How should gains from trade be distributed within countries? Who's responsible when trade disrupts lives and communities? There are no simple answers, only difficult trade-offs. Trade creates overall gains but distributes them unequally. Trade can foster development but can also lock countries into disadvantageous positions. Trade requires rules, but rules often reflect power imbalances, with wealthy countries shaping them to their advantage. Think about China's integration into global trade since the 1980s. China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, gaining access to global markets. Its exports surged, lifting hundreds of millions from poverty. But this also disrupted industries worldwide. American and European factories couldn't compete with Chinese wages. Jobs disappeared. Communities declined. Meanwhile, China accumulated massive trade surpluses and foreign exchange reserves, creating global imbalances. Was this good or bad? For Chinese workers, it was transformative. Opportunities that didn't exist before, rising incomes, better lives. For American manufacturing workers, it was devastating. Lost jobs, reduced bargaining power, economic insecurity. For global consumers, it meant cheaper goods. Electronics, clothing, furniture cost less, raising living standards. For the environment, it meant pollution. China's rapid industrialization created severe environmental damage that affects everyone. Trade is not simply good or bad. It's a mechanism that creates possibilities, distributes them unevenly, requires political choices about rules and compensation, and how gains and losses are shared. Countries that have used trade successfully, East Asian tigers, more recently China and Vietnam, have done so strategically, not by simply opening to global markets, but by managing openness, protecting learning, investing in capabilities, gradually moving up value chains. Countries that remain trapped in commodity dependence show trade's darker possibilities. When you export what you've always exported, import what you've always imported, when the terms of trade move against you, when you can't move into manufacturing because established competitors block the path, trade can perpetuate rather than reduce inequality. The future of trade is uncertain. Automation may reduce the advantage of low wages, bringing manufacturing back to wealthy countries but without the jobs. Climate change may require rethinking global supply chains that depend on shipping goods halfway around the world. Rising nationalism and protectionism may fragment global markets, or new technologies may create new opportunities for participation and development. What's clear is that trade alone can't ensure development. It must be combined with the other factors we've explored: good institutions, human capital investment, strategic industrial policy, infrastructure development. Trade is one tool among many, powerful but not sufficient, beneficial but not automatically so, requiring wisdom and policy and attention to how gains are distributed. Let that settle. Think about those iPhones assembled from global components, about farmers in Mexico competing with subsidized American corn, about Chinese factory workers whose labor lifted them from poverty. Trade connects countries, creates interdependence, distributes opportunities and disruptions. It's neither the enemy of development nor its automatic guarantor. Like so much in economics, it depends on context, on institutions, on choices. Countries that use trade wisely, as part of broader development strategies, can prosper. Countries that engage with trade from weak positions without strategic vision may find themselves locked into disadvantageous patterns. The challenge is managing trade to serve development rather than assuming trade automatically delivers it. But trade connects countries economically. What transforms them more fundamentally is technology, is innovation, is the ability to do more with less. That's where we turn next, to how technology and innovation create gaps between rich and poor countries, and how those gaps might be bridged. Trade connects countries, as we've explored, creates interdependence, distributes opportunities. But trade in goods and services, crucial as it is, doesn't fully explain why some countries grow rich while others stagnate. What transforms economies more fundamentally is technology, the knowledge and tools and processes that allow us to produce more from the same inputs, to do things that were previously impossible, to multiply human effort beyond what muscle and brain alone can achieve. Technology is perhaps the invisible force that has most divided rich and poor countries over the past 2.5 centuries. Let's explore how innovation creates wealth, why some countries innovate while others struggle to adopt existing technologies, and how the technological frontier shapes global inequality. Think about what technology actually means. It's not just machines or computers or gadgets, though these are part of it. technology is knowledge applied to production. It's knowing how to forge steel that's stronger and lighter. It's understanding chemistry well enough to synthesize medicines or fertilizers or plastics. It's organizing production efficiently so workers accomplish more with less wasted effort. It's communication systems that let information flow instantly across continents. Technology is the accumulated knowledge of humanity about how to transform resources into things we want and need. Robert Solow, who won the Nobel Prize in economics for his work on growth theory, showed mathematically that sustained economic growth requires technological progress. You can grow temporarily by accumulating more capital, building more factories, buying more machines, or by increasing labour, having more workers. But these sources of growth eventually exhaust themselves. Returns to capital diminish as you accumulate more. Labour force growth is limited by population. Without technological progress, growth eventually stops. But with technological progress, growth can continue indefinitely. Better technology means the same workers with the same capital produce more output. A farmer with a tractor produces more than a farmer with a hoe. A factory with computer-controlled machinery produces more than one with manual tools. An economy with the internet can coordinate activity more efficiently than one limited to phones and mail. Technology multiplies productivity. And productivity growth is what makes countries wealthy over time. The Industrial Revolution, which began in Britain in the late 1700s and spread gradually across Europe and North America through the 1800s, represents the pivotal moment when sustained technological progress became normal rather than exceptional. Before industrialization, technological change was slow. Improvements happened. Better ploughs, water wheels, metallurgy, but incrementally. Over centuries. Living standards in 1700 weren't dramatically different from living standards in 1000. Most people were farmers. Most production was agricultural. Most societies remained poor. But industrialization changed everything. Steam engines that could power factories and locomotives and ships. Mechanized textile production that could weave cloth far faster than human weavers. Steel production that enabled railways and bridges and machines. Chemical processes that created fertilizers and dyes and medicines. Electricity that could light cities and power countless applications. Each innovation built on previous ones. The pace of change accelerated. Within a century, Britain and other industrializing nations transformed utterly. This created what economic historians call the Great Divergence. Before 1800, income differences between the world's richest and poorest regions were perhaps 3 or 4 to 1. Substantial, but not enormous. By 1900, the gap had widened to perhaps 20 to 1. By 2000, it was more like 40 to 1 between the richest and poorest countries. This widening happened because some countries industrialized while others didn't, and industrialization created unprecedented wealth. Why did industrialization begin in Britain specifically? Historians debate this. Britain had coal and iron deposits accessible to each other. It had navigable rivers and a good canal system for moving goods. It had a relatively secure system of property rights that encouraged investment. It had accumulated capital from trade, including the slave trade. It had scientific societies and a culture of experimentation. It had high wages that made labour-saving machinery profitable. Probably all these factors mattered, creating conditions where innovation was both possible and profitable. But notice that geography alone doesn't explain it. China had sophisticated technology in 1500. Gunpowder, the compass, printing, advanced metallurgy. The Islamic world had preserved and expanded Greek and Roman knowledge while Europe floundered in the Dark Ages. India had advanced textile production. These civilizations weren't backward or incapable. But they didn't experience sustained industrial revolution. The reasons are complex. Political fragmentation in Europe may have fostered competition and innovation that large stable empires didn't need. Specific institutional arrangements in Britain protected inventors and rewarded innovation. Contingent historical factors created the particular confluence of circumstances that made Britain the birthplace of industrialization. Once begun, industrialization spread, but unevenly. It spread first to northwestern Europe, Belgium, France, Germany, the Netherlands, and to the United States. These regions had geographic proximity to Britain, cultural and trade connections, similar institutions, and could adopt British technologies. By the late 1800s, they were industrializing rapidly, building railways and factories and urban centres. But industrialization didn't spread everywhere. Colonial powers actively prevented it in their colonies. Britain, as we discussed earlier, destroyed India's textile industry to protect its own. European powers structured colonial economies to export raw materials, not to develop manufacturing. This was deliberate policy, not natural outcome. Colonizers wanted captive markets for their manufactures and cheap sources of raw materials. They didn't want competitors, even after independence. Technology transfer remained difficult. Developing countries faced what economists call the, quote, 15 and the, quote, 16 simultaneously. The advantage is that late developers can adopt existing technologies without having to invent them. Japan in the late 1800s could import Western industrial technologies rather than developing them from scratch. This should allow rapid catch-up growth. But barriers exist too. Technology isn't just machines you can buy. It's knowledge, skills, organizational methods, supply chains, complementary technologies. A factory requires not just machinery, but trained workers who can operate and maintain it, managers who can organize production, suppliers who provide materials reliably, customers who will buy output, infrastructure like electricity and transportation. Acquiring all these complementary factors is difficult. Moreover, technologies are often tacit rather than codified. You can't learn how to run a steel mill just by reading manuals. You need experienced workers and managers. You need trial and error. You need institutional capacity. Transferring this tacit knowledge is slow and uncertain. Some countries have managed it successfully. Japan, as we've mentioned, adopted Western technologies in the late 1800s. It sent students abroad to learn. It hired foreign experts to teach in Japan. It reverse-engineered imported products. It adapted technologies to Japanese circumstances. By the early 1900s, Japan was producing its own steel and ships and textiles competitively. South Korea followed a similar path a century later. In the 1960s and 70s, Korean companies licensed technologies from abroad, hired foreign engineers, sent Korean engineers for training overseas. They started by assembling products designed elsewhere, then gradually took on more of the value chain, manufacturing components, then designing products, then conducting research. Samsung began as a trading company, then a low-cost manufacturer. Then a technology company competing at the frontier. This progression took decades of sustained effort. China, since the 1980s, has pursued technology acquisition aggressively. Foreign companies wanting to sell in China's huge market often had to transfer technology to Chinese partners. Chinese students studying abroad, hundreds of thousands of them, brought back knowledge. Chinese companies copied foreign products, sometimes legally through licensing, sometimes through industrial espionage. Gradually, Chinese companies moved from imitation to innovation. Huawei, BYD, Alibaba, Tencent. These companies now develop technologies that compete globally. Critics in wealthy countries complain about Chinese technology acquisition methods, particularly intellectual property theft. But from a development perspective, this is how late industrializers have always caught up. Britain's early industrialization involves stealing technologies from elsewhere, textile techniques from India, mechanical ideas from France. The United States in the 19th century routinely violated British patents and copyrights. Technology transfer has always involved some combination of legitimate purchase, adaptation, and copying. The question is whether countries move beyond imitation to genuine innovation. Japan did. South Korea is doing so. China is in transition, still copying in some areas, innovating in others. Success requires not just acquiring technologies, but developing the institutional and human capital to generate new technologies domestically. Research and development investment matters enormously. Countries at the technological frontier, the United States, Japan, Germany, increasingly China, spend 2 to 4% of GDP on research and development. This funding supports universities conducting basic research, companies developing new products and processes, government labs working on fundamental science. The returns are diffuse and long-term, but essential for staying at the frontier. Poor countries spend far less, often under 1% of their GDP. Partly this reflects poverty, when resources are scarce. Immediate needs take priority over long-term research, but it also reflects rational calculation. Why invest heavily in research when you can adopt existing technologies developed elsewhere? The problem is that without domestic research capacity, countries remain dependent on technologies developed elsewhere, vulnerable to being left behind when technological paradigms shift. Universities play crucial roles in generating and diffusing technology. MIT, Stanford, Cambridge, Tokyo University, ETH Zurich. These institutions conduct research that creates new knowledge and train students who spread that knowledge through industry and society. Countries that have developed successfully have invariably invested in higher education and research universities. South Korea built KAIST and other research universities. Singapore invested in the National University of Singapore. China massively expanded its university system and is building world-class research capacity. Patent systems attempt to balance incentives for innovation with diffusion of knowledge. Patents grant inventors temporary monopolies, typically 20 years, to profit from their inventions. This encourages innovation by allowing inventors to recoup research costs. But patents also restrict access, making technologies expensive for poor countries. Drug patents, for instance, mean new medicines cost far more than generic versions, putting them out of reach for poor populations. The debate over intellectual property and development is contentious. Pharmaceutical companies argue that strong patent protection is necessary to fund research into new drugs. Without profits from patents, they claim, innovation would cease. Development advocates argue that patents on essential medicines are morally indefensible when people die from treatable diseases because they can't afford patented drugs. Some argue for differential pricing, cheaper prices in poor countries, or for loosening patent protections for essential goods. But technology isn't always about cutting-edge innovation. Sometimes it's about adopting basic existing technologies that wealthy countries take for granted. Electrification, for instance. Much of sub-Saharan Africa lacks reliable electricity. Extending power grids to rural areas is expensive and slow. This lack of electricity limits what's possible. No refrigeration for food or vaccines, no power for machinery, limited lighting that restricts productive hours, no ability to charge phones or use computers. Here we see leapfrogging possibilities, just as many developing countries skipped landline phones and went straight to mobile phones. Renewable energy technologies may allow countries to leapfrog centralized power grids. Solar panels and batteries are becoming cheap enough that households and villages can generate their own electricity without waiting for grid extensions. This distributed generation model may work better than trying to replicate the centralized grid model that developed countries use. Mobile phones themselves represent technology's democratizing potential. 20 years ago, most people in poor countries had no phone access. Now billions have mobile phones, even in very poor regions. These phones aren't just communication devices, they're platforms for mobile banking. Kenya's M-Pesa allows people without bank accounts to send and receive money via phone, transforming how commerce works. They're educational tools. Students can access information and learning resources. Their agricultural tools. Farmers can check crop prices before going to market, get weather forecasts, access extension services. Their health tools. Remote medical consultations, health records, appointment reminders. The spread of mobile phones in Africa happened faster than anyone predicted. In 2000, perhaps 1 in 50 Africans had a phone. By 2020, it was more than 4 in 5. This happened without massive infrastructure investment, without central planning, driven by market forces and appropriate technology. Mobile phones worked in African contexts. They're portable, run on batteries when electricity is unreliable, serve multiple purposes, costs kept falling. The internet offers similar possibilities, but also highlights the digital divide. Internet access correlates strongly with development. High-speed broadband enables telecommuting, online education, e-commerce, access to information, and entertainment and services. Countries with widespread internet access have economic advantages over those without. But extending internet access to remote or poor areas faces challenges: infrastructure costs, low purchasing power, limited digital literacy. The COVID-19 pandemic highlighted these divides starkly. When schools closed and education moved online, students in wealthy countries with computers and internet could continue learning. Students in poor countries or poor regions often couldn't. When offices closed and work moved remote, jobs that could be done from home continued. Jobs requiring physical presence were lost. The virus affected everyone, but existing inequalities in technology access shaped who could adapt and who suffered. Digital technologies create other challenges too. Automation and artificial intelligence may eliminate jobs faster than new jobs are created. If factories can operate with robots instead of workers, what happens to the development path that East Asian countries followed? If software can perform tasks previously done by educated workers, translating documents, writing code, analyzing legal contracts, diagnosing diseases, what comparative advantage do developing countries have? These questions don't have clear answers yet. Technology might create new opportunities we can't foresee. History shows that technological change creates new jobs even as it destroys old ones. Farm mechanization eliminated agricultural jobs, but created industrial jobs. Industrial automation eliminated manufacturing jobs, but created service jobs. But the pace of change may be faster now, and the new jobs may require skills that take time to develop. One hopeful pattern is that technology has become more accessible over time. Early industrial technologies, steam engines, steel mills, required massive capital and were controlled by wealthy countries and companies. Modern technologies, software, digital services, and manufacturing technologies have lower barriers to entry. An entrepreneur in Nairobi or Lagos or Dhaka can develop a software application with just a computer and internet connection. This democratization of technology access creates opportunities that didn't exist in previous eras. But access to technology alone isn't enough. Countries need the human capital to use technologies effectively, the institutions to support innovation and protect intellectual property, the infrastructure to enable technology diffusion, the capital to invest in research and development. Technology interacts with all the other factors we've discussed: geography, institutions, human capital, trade. It's not a magic solution, but one element in the complex system that produces development. Let that settle for a moment. Think about the extraordinary changes technology has brought, from steam engines to smartphones, from hand looms to automated factories, from messages carried by horseback to information flowing instantly worldwide. Think about how these changes created the vast gaps between rich and poor countries, and also about how they create possibilities for catching up. Technology is knowledge, and knowledge can spread, can be learned, can be adapted. The countries that have narrowed the development gap have done so largely by mastering technologies that were once exclusive to wealthy nations. The countries that remain behind often lack not natural resources or industrious people, but access to and ability to use modern technologies. Bridging that gap remains one of development's central challenges. But even with good institutions and educated populations and access to global markets and modern technologies, countries can still struggle if they're trapped in conflict and instability. Violence destroys what development builds. Chaos prevents the patient accumulation of capital and knowledge that prosperity requires. That's where we turn next, to how conflict and instability trap countries in poverty, creating vicious cycles that seem impossible to break. Technology creates possibilities for development, as we've explored, knowledge that can be learned and applied to multiply human effort. But even with good institutions and educated populations and access to global markets and modern technologies, countries can still struggle if they're trapped in conflict and instability. War destroys what development builds. Violence disrupts the patient accumulation of capital and knowledge that prosperity requires. Political chaos drives away investment and talent. Let's explore how conflict and instability trap countries in poverty, creating vicious cycles that seem nearly impossible to break, and consider what it takes to escape these traps. War is development in reverse. Every bridge destroyed is years of investment lost. Every factory burned is employment and production eliminated. Every skilled worker killed or displaced is human capital vanished. Every child kept from school by violence is potential unrealized. The physical destruction of war is visible and dramatic, but the institutional and social destruction runs deeper and lasts longer. Consider Afghanistan, a country that has known little peace for over 4 decades. The Soviet invasion in 1979 initiated years of warfare. The Soviets withdrew in 1989, but civil war continued through the 1990s. The Taliban took control, then were overthrown by American-led forces in 2001. 2 decades of occupation and insurgency followed. Throughout this period, Afghanistan remained desperately poor. The reasons aren't mysterious. Infrastructure destroyed by war wasn't rebuilt. Schools and hospitals operated sporadically, if at all. Businesses couldn't function when security was uncertain and property rights meant nothing. Farmers grew poppies for opium rather than food crops, because poppies were valuable enough to justify the risks. Talented Afghans fled if they could, seeking safety and opportunity elsewhere. Foreign aid flowed in, but much was wasted or stolen, spent on security rather than development, or simply disappeared into corruption. Afghanistan's GDP per capita in 2020 was around $500, among the lowest in the world. Life expectancy was around 64 years. Literacy was under 40%. These aren't inevitable features of Afghan geography or culture. They're consequences of decades of continuous warfare that prevented normal economic and social development. Syria offers a more recent example of how quickly conflict can destroy prosperity. Before the civil war began in 2011, Syria was a middle-income country. It had functioning infrastructure, universal primary education, decent healthcare, substantial urban development. Life expectancy was around 75 years. The economy, while not thriving, provided basic living standards for most citizens. Then came civil war, initially protests against the government, then armed rebellion, then multi-sided conflict involving government forces, various rebel groups, Kurdish militias, ISIS, and foreign powers. The war destroyed half the country's housing stock. It demolished industrial capacity. It displaced half the population, some internally, millions as refugees fleeing to Turkey and Jordan and Lebanon and Europe. Hundreds of thousands died. The economy collapsed. By 2020, Syria's GDP had fallen by more than half from pre-war levels. Poverty rates that had been around 10% before the war rose to 90%. Life expectancy fell. Educational systems collapsed. Schools became military positions or shelters for displaced people. The healthcare system that had provided decent coverage became barely functional. Syria went from middle income to devastated in less than a decade. Paul Collier, an economist who has studied conflict extensively, identifies patterns in how countries fall into civil war traps. Countries with certain characteristics – low income, slow growth, dependence on natural resource exports, ethnic divisions, bad neighbourhoods where conflict spills across borders – face much higher risks of civil war. And once civil war starts, it tends to persist. Why? Because war creates conditions that perpetuate war. Armed groups need funding, so they turn to extortion, smuggling, controlling mines, or drug production. These economic activities become profitable for those controlling them. War destroys normal economic opportunities, so joining an armed group may be the best option available to young men. Grievances multiply as atrocities are committed and cycles of revenge begin. Peace seems impossible because factions don't trust each other and have economic interest in continuing conflict. Natural resources, which we discussed earlier as potentially problematic, become especially dangerous in fragile states. Oil or diamonds or other valuable resources provide funding for armed groups. They create incentives to fight for control of resource-rich regions. They make negotiated settlements difficult because whoever controls resources controls enormous wealth. The Democratic Republic of Congo illustrates this tragic pattern. Congo has extraordinary natural resources: diamonds, gold, copper, cobalt, coltan used in electronics. It should be wealthy. Instead, it's one of the world's poorest countries, with per capita income around $500. Conflict has raged in eastern Congo for decades, funded partly by control of mines. Armed groups fight for mineral-rich areas. They use forced labour to extract minerals. They sell minerals to international markets through complex smuggling networks. The population suffers while resources flow out and weapons flow in. Political instability short of civil war also destroys development prospects. Coups, where military factions seize power, create uncertainty that paralyzes economic activity. Investors flee or refuse to invest when property rights are insecure and governments might be overthrown at any moment. Talent emigrates to more stable countries. Each coup makes the next more likely, as institutions weaken and military intervention becomes normalized. Capital flight, when a country's own citizens move their money abroad, drains resources that could finance development. When wealthy Nigerians or Russians or Venezuelans keep their money in London or New York banks rather than investing domestically, they're making rational individual decisions but creating collective problems. They don't trust that their property will be protected, that their businesses won't be arbitrarily seized, that currency won't collapse, so they protect themselves by moving assets abroad. But this means capital that could build factories or fund businesses or develop infrastructure instead sits in foreign banks, benefiting other countries. Understanding poverty traps requires seeing how different disadvantages reinforce each other. Poor countries have low savings because incomes are low. Low savings mean low investment. Low investment means low productivity. Low productivity means low incomes. The cycle is closed. Breaking it requires somehow increasing investment above what current savings support. But where does that investment come from? Jeffrey Sachs, an economist who has worked extensively on development, argues for a big push, large-scale coordinated investment to jumpstart development. His argument is that incremental change can't work when countries face poverty traps. You need simultaneous investment in infrastructure, health, education, institutions. This requires external financing because poor countries can't generate sufficient domestic resources. Foreign aid, properly designed and sufficient in scale, could provide the push needed to escape the trap. The theory is appealing, but implementation is difficult. Aid has a mixed record. Some aid succeeds. The Marshall Plan helped rebuild Europe after World War II, though Europe had educated populations and functional institutions to build on. The Green Revolution in agriculture increased yields dramatically through new seed varieties and techniques, lifting millions from hunger. Smallpox eradication showed what coordinated global effort could achieve, but much aid fails to generate development. It's stolen through corruption. It's wasted on projects that don't fit local needs. It creates dependency rather than self-sustaining growth. It flows to politically connected elites rather than productive uses. Aid donors push their own agendas rather than responding to recipient priorities. The aid industry becomes self-perpetuating, with consultants and NGOs and administrators consuming resources without creating development. William Easterly, another development economist, critiques the big push approach. He argues that development happens through incremental learning, adaptation to local circumstances, bottom-up initiatives. Top-down plans fail because planners lack local knowledge, because political incentives are wrong, because development is complex and can't be engineered. He advocates for more modest, experimental approaches, find what works in specific contexts, support local initiatives, allow for failure and learning. The debate continues. Both perspectives contain truth. Some problems do require coordinated, large-scale intervention. You can't build a railway network incrementally. But development also requires countless small decisions and adaptations that can't be planned centrally. Finding the balance is the challenge. Failed states, countries where government effectively ceases to function, represent the extreme end of institutional collapse. Somalia spent decades without effective central government after 1991. Different regions were controlled by warlords, clan militias, Islamist groups. Basic services like education and healthcare depended on private provision or aid organizations. There was no functioning legal system, no police, no national economic policy. Trade happened informally. Piracy off Somalia's coast became a significant problem as young men with few other economic opportunities turned to hijacking ships. Failed states create humanitarian crises, famine, disease, displacement. They also create regional problems, refugees flowing to neighbouring countries, armed groups crossing borders, ungoverned spaces where terrorists can operate. Somalia's failure affected Kenya and Ethiopia. Syria's collapse sent millions of refugees to Turkey and Jordan and Lebanon, straining those countries' resources and stability. Failed states are tragedies for their own populations and problems for the international system. Rebuilding failed states is extraordinarily difficult. It requires establishing security, which is hard when armed groups have proliferated. It requires building institutions from almost nothing without experienced bureaucrats or functional systems. It requires convincing displaced populations to return, attracting investment when risks are enormous, creating the tax base to fund government. It requires years or decades of sustained effort with uncertain success. Yet some countries have recovered from collapse. Rwanda, which we'll discuss more in the next section, experienced genocide in 1994. 800,000 people murdered in 100 days. The country was shattered. But Rwanda rebuilt under Paul Kagame's leadership, establishing security, rebuilding institutions, pursuing development. By 2020, Rwanda had made remarkable progress, though Kagame's authoritarian methods raise questions about sustainability. Mozambique endured 15 years of devastating civil war that ended in 1992. The country was desperately poor, infrastructure destroyed, millions displaced, hundreds of thousands dead. But Mozambique achieved peace, demobilized fighters, held elections, began rebuilding. Progress has been uneven and slow. But the country avoided returning to war and has achieved modest economic growth. These recoveries show that collapse isn't permanent. With peace, with adequate leadership, with international support, countries can rebuild. But it requires ending violence first, which is often the hardest step. While fighting continues, development is impossible. The middle-income trap represents a different kind of stagnation. Some countries develop successfully from low to middle income but then struggle to advance further. They move from agriculture to manufacturing, raising income substantially, but then they face competition from lower-wage countries for labour-intensive manufacturing while lacking the technology and skills to compete with wealthy countries in high-value production. They're stuck between low-wage and high-wage competitors. Malaysia and Brazil illustrate this trap. Both reached middle-income status, several $1,000s per capita. Both have substantial industry and modern infrastructure. But both have struggled to break through to high income. They can't compete with Bangladesh or Vietnam in low-wage manufacturing. They can't compete with Japan or Germany in advanced manufacturing, or with the United States in technology and innovation. Growth stagnates. They're caught in the middle. Escaping the middle-income trap requires transition to innovation-based growth. This means investing heavily in education and research, developing technological capability, moving up value chains. Is what South Korea and Taiwan managed, but Malaysia and Brazil haven't yet. It requires institutional quality that supports innovation, human capital development, strategic industrial policy. It's difficult and uncertain. Thinking about all these traps and challenges can feel overwhelming. Countries face obstacles that seem insurmountable, conflict that destroys development, poverty that prevents the investment needed to escape poverty, middle-income stagnation that blocks advancement. Institutions are weak. Capital flees. Talent emigrates. Natural resources curse rather than bless. Aid fails more often than it succeeds. But these aren't inevitable. They're difficult, but not impossible to overcome. We know this because countries have done it. They've escaped poverty traps through right combinations of leadership and policy and external support. They've ended civil wars and rebuilt. They've transformed institutions and created growth. The existence of success stories proves that geography isn't destiny. History isn't fate. Current poverty doesn't determine future poverty. Let that rest in your mind. The patterns we've explored, conflict destroying development, instability preventing investment, poverty traps creating vicious cycles, these are real and powerful. Countries face genuine obstacles, but countries also make choices. Leadership matters. Institutions can change. Conflicts can end. Traps can be escaped. We've discussed general patterns and theories. Now let's examine specific comparisons, natural experiments where similar countries took different paths and reached different destinations. These comparisons illuminate which factors truly matter, which choices truly make a difference. The patterns we've explored, conflict destroying development, instability preventing investment, poverty traps creating vicious cycles, these are real and powerful forces. Countries face genuine obstacles, difficulties that seem overwhelming. But we also know that these obstacles aren't insurmountable, that geography isn't destiny, that history doesn't determine the future. We know this because we can observe countries that started from similar positions, but ended in vastly different places. Theory helps us understand general principles, but comparisons help us see what actually matters. When countries begin similarly and diverge dramatically, we can glimpse which factors truly shape outcomes. Let's examine these natural experiments, these paired comparisons that illuminate our question with unusual clarity. The Korean Peninsula offers perhaps the starkest natural experiment in modern history. Here we have people who share thousands of years of history, who spoke the same language, who inherited the same cultural traditions, who lived on the same land with the same climate and geography. They were one nation until 1945. When the peninsula was divided at the 38th parallel as the Second World War ended, the north fell under Soviet influence, the south under American influence. What followed over the next 7 decades was a profound divergence. North Korea built a totalitarian communist system under Kim Il-sung, and later his son Kim Jong-il and grandson Kim Jong-un. The state controlled everything, all property, all production, all information, all movement. Private enterprise was forbidden, markets were eliminated, Individual choice was crushed beneath rigid state planning. The Kim family became objects of mandatory worship. Citizens were ranked by perceived loyalty to the regime. Dissent meant imprisonment or death. The entire society was organized around maintaining the Kim dynasty's power. South Korea's path was rocky at first. It had military dictatorships through the 1960s and 70s. Democracy came gradually, sometimes violently contested. But even under authoritarian rule, South Korea maintained private property, allowed markets to function, permitted individual economic initiative. The government guided development but didn't attempt total control. Education was emphasized, creating literate and skilled populations. The country opened to trade and foreign investment, and crucially, political power eventually transitioned to democracy through popular pressure and institutional reform. By 2020, the contrast was total. South Korea's per capita income was around $31,000. North Korea's was estimated at $1,800, less than 6% of South Korea's. South Koreans lived in a prosperous democracy with cutting-edge technology, global cultural influence, advanced manufacturing, world-class universities. North Koreans lived in isolated poverty, subject to famines, lacking basic freedoms, cut off from the world. Their economy stagnant and backward. Same people, same peninsula. The differences were entirely the result of institutions and policies chosen after 1945. North Korea's extractive institutions, total state control, no property rights, no individual freedom, prevented development despite educated populations and mineral resources. South Korea's increasingly inclusive institutions, property rights, markets, eventual democracy, rule of law, fostered dramatic development. The comparison could hardly be clearer. Botswana and Zimbabwe offer another instructive pairing. Both are landlocked countries in southern Africa. Both were British colonies. Both have significant natural resources. Botswana has diamonds. Zimbabwe has fertile land and minerals. Both gained independence with similar challenges, limited infrastructure, small educated populations, colonial legacies. But their paths diverged dramatically. Botswana, as we discussed earlier, built democratic institutions and maintained them. Seretse Khama and his successors governed reasonably well, avoided major corruption, invested resource revenues in public goods. Elections have been regular and generally free since independence in 1966. Courts function adequately. Property rights are secure. Civil service is relatively competent. The government negotiated favourable terms with diamond companies and managed revenues prudently. Zimbabwe under Robert Mugabe started promisingly but deteriorated. Early years after independence in 1980 saw investments in education and healthcare, reconciliation between black and white citizens, economic growth. But Mugabe increasingly concentrated power, suppressed opposition, used state resources to reward loyalists. The catastrophic land reform of the early 2000s destroyed property rights and agricultural production. Institutions eroded. Elections were manipulated. Opposition was harassed. Economic policy became incoherent. By 2020, Botswana's per capita income was around $7,000. Zimbabwe's was around $1,500. Botswana had maintained stability and achieved steady growth. Zimbabwe had experienced economic collapse and hyperinflation. Both countries faced challenges. HIV/AIDS hit Botswana particularly hard, and inequality remains high. But Botswana's institutional choices created development while Zimbabwe's destroyed it. The comparison is striking because the countries are so similar in many ways. Geography, colonial history, resource endowments. These don't explain the difference. Institutions do. Botswana built inclusive institutions that protected property rights and maintained rule of law. Zimbabwe maintained and worsened extractive institutions. The outcomes followed predictably. Haiti and the Dominican Republic share the island of Hispaniola in the Caribbean. You can stand at the border and see the difference. The Dominican side has forests. The Haitian side is deforested and eroded. The countries share similar geography and climate but have vastly different outcomes. The Dominican Republic's per capita income is around $8,000. Haiti's is around $800, 1/10 as much. The divergence has deep historical roots. Haiti was France's richest colony, producing enormous wealth through brutal slavery. The successful slave revolution of 1804 created the first Black Republic, but also Haiti's enduring problems. France demanded massive reparations for recognizing independence. Other nations, fearing slave revolts elsewhere, isolated Haiti diplomatically and economically. The plantation economy was destroyed by war. The institutions that had governed the colony were purely extractive and provided no foundation for building a nation. The Dominican Republic, which occupies the eastern 2/3 of the island, was a Spanish colony with different economic and social structures. It had less plantation agriculture and less concentrated in sugar and coffee. It gained independence later, and with less violence. Its institutions, while far from perfect, were less extractive than Haiti's. It developed more stable governance, better infrastructure, more diversified economy. These historical differences created path dependencies. Haiti struggled with political instability, coup, dictatorships, foreign occupations. The United States occupied Haiti from 1915 to 1934, ostensibly to stabilize the country but leaving institutions no stronger. The Duvalier dictatorships from 1957 to 1986 were predatory and violent. Democratic transitions have been fragile and incomplete. Earthquakes and hurricanes cause more damage in Haiti than in the Dominican Republic, partly because Haitian buildings and infrastructure are poorer quality. The Dominican Republic has had its own problems: dictatorships, corruption, inequality. But it achieved greater political stability and better economic management. It developed tourism, manufacturing, services. It maintained forests better than Haiti. Its institutions, while imperfect, functioned better than Haiti's dysfunctional state. The island comparison is particularly powerful because geography is identical. Same climate, same rainfall, same soils. The differences are entirely social, political, institutional. They trace back to different colonial experiences and the choices made after independence. History created different starting points, and those starting points led to different paths. East and West Germany provide yet another comparison, though this one had a resolution when the countries reunified in 1990. Before 1945, Germany was one country. Same people, same language, same culture, same history. Division after World War II created two Germanys with radically different systems. East Germany became communist, part of the Soviet bloc. The state owned all major industries. Central planning directed the economy. Individual freedoms were restricted. The Stasi, the secret police, surveilled citizens. People attempting to flee to West Germany were shot at the Berlin Wall. Living standards were adequate by communist standards but far below Western levels. West Germany became democratic and capitalist, part of the Western Alliance. Markets allocated resources. Private property was protected. Democracy functioned despite Germany's Nazi past. The Marshall Plan provided aid for reconstruction. The economy boomed through the 1950s and 60s, the Wirtschaftswunder or economic miracle. Living standards rose to match other Western European countries. When the wall fell in 1989 and Germany reunified in 1990, the differences were stark. West Germany's economy was far larger despite smaller population. Productivity was higher, infrastructure was better. Environmental quality was better. East German industry had created severe pollution. The human cost was visible too. East Germans had lived under surveillance and restriction, unable to speak freely or travel, their potential constrained. Reunification was expensive and difficult. integrating East Germany required massive transfers from west to east, over €1 trillion over 20 years. Unemployment in the east was high as inefficient industries closed. But reunification was possible because Germans shared language and culture, because West Germany had resources to invest, because institutions could be transplanted. Still, differences persist decades later. Eastern Germany remains poorer, has higher unemployment, has different political attitudes shaped by communist experience. The German case shows both how much institutions matter and how difficult institutional change is. East Germany didn't lack educated people or industrial capacity. It had reasonably good infrastructure by communist standards. But communist institutions prevented prosperity. Market institutions and democracy in West Germany fostered it. Yet even after adopting Western institutions, East Germany couldn't immediately catch up, showing that institutions take time to work and that communist experience left lasting marks. Singapore and its Southeast Asian neighbours offer a different kind of comparison. Singapore at independence in 1965 seemed to have poor prospects. It was tiny, with no natural resources, not even fresh water. It was ethnically diverse in ways that created potential for conflict. Chinese majority with Malay and Indian minorities. It had been expelled from Malaysia and faced uncertain future. But Singapore's leadership, particularly Lee Kuan Yew, built effective institutions. They created a competent civil service recruited by merit and paid well enough to reduce corruption. They established rule of law with courts that were relatively impartial. They invested heavily in education, creating skilled workforce. They welcomed foreign investment, positioning Singapore as manufacturing and financial hub. They maintained political stability through somewhat authoritarian means, but avoided the extreme repression of truly extractive regimes. Compare this to the Philippines, which had better initial conditions in many ways, larger, resource-rich, higher literacy rates at independence. The Philippines started the post-war period as one of Asia's most developed countries, but it suffered from weak institutions, corruption, political instability, inequality. The Marcos dictatorship from 1972 to 1986 was predatory, stealing billions while the economy stagnated. Democratic transitions since have been incomplete, with political dynasties controlling power, corruption remaining endemic, growth slower than East Asian neighbours. By 2020, Singapore's per capita income was around $60,000, among the world's highest. The Philippines was around $3,000. Singapore had become a global financial centre, a hub for technology and trade, with world-class infrastructure and education. The Philippines remained middle income, with substantial poverty, weaker institutions, less development. Or compare Singapore to Myanmar, formerly Burma. Myanmar at independence had substantial advantages: fertile land, natural resources including oil and gas, good infrastructure left by British colonizers. It was wealthier than most Asian countries in the 1950s. But military rule beginning in 1962 isolated Myanmar, implemented bizarre economic policies, repressed ethnic minorities, created dysfunctional institutions. The country stagnated for decades while neighbours prospered. Singapore's success wasn't inevitable. It faced real challenges, and Lee Kuan Yew's authoritarian methods raised questions about trade-offs between order and freedom. But Singapore's institutional choices, meritocracy, rule of law, openness to trade, investment in human capital, created prosperity. The Philippines and Myanmar, with better geographic endowments, failed to develop because institutions failed. Taiwan and mainland China offer a comparison with an interesting twist. After the Chinese Civil War ended in 1949, the defeated nationalist government fled to Taiwan, while communists under Mao Zedong controlled the mainland. For decades, Taiwan and China developed separately under different systems. Taiwan maintained private property and markets while pursuing export-led growth. It invested heavily in education. It had authoritarian government under Chiang Kai-shek and his son, but eventually democratized in the 1980s and 90s. The economy grew rapidly, transforming Taiwan from poor agricultural society to industrial powerhouse to technology leader. TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, became the world's most advanced chip maker. Mainland China under Mao pursued radical communism, collectivized agriculture, eliminated private property, attempted rapid industrialization through disastrous Great Leap Forward that caused famine killing millions, then the Cultural Revolution that destroyed institutions and persecuted educated people. China remained desperately poor through the 1970s. For decades, Taiwan was far wealthier than mainland China. Taiwan's per capita income was perhaps 10 or 15 times China's by the 1970s. The comparison seemed to show that markets and private property vastly outperformed communism. But then China changed. Deng Xiaoping's reforms starting in 1978 gradually introduced market mechanisms while maintaining Communist Party control. Special economic zones allowed capitalism. Private enterprise was permitted. Agriculture was decollectivized. Foreign investment was welcomed. China's economy began growing rapidly. Over 4 decades, hundreds of millions were lifted from poverty. China became the world's factory and increasingly a technology power. By 2020, China's per capita income was around $10,000, still below Taiwan's $45,000, but having closed much of the gap. China's total economy was far larger than Taiwan's due to population size. The comparison now shows something different, that institutional change is possible, that countries can shift from extractive to more inclusive institutions, that policy choices matter enormously. Taiwan still has advantages: fuller democracy, stronger rule of law, better protection of intellectual property. But China's partial reforms, maintaining political authoritarianism while allowing economic freedom, have generated remarkable growth. Whether this model is sustainable or whether China will face crises without fuller political reform remains uncertain. These comparisons, Korea's, Botswana and Zimbabwe, Haiti and Dominican Republic, Germany's, Singapore and neighbours, Taiwan and China, all point toward the same conclusion. Geography matters but doesn't determine outcomes. History shapes trajectories but doesn't lock countries into permanent positions. What matters most are institutions, are the rules and norms and organisations that structure how societies function. And institutions can change, though change is difficult and uncertain. The natural experiments show us that small differences can compound over decades into enormous gaps. They show us that leadership matters. Seretse Khama in Botswana, Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, Deng Xiaoping in China made choices that shaped their nations. They show us that there are different paths to development. South Korea's path differed from Singapore's, which differed from Botswana's, but successful paths share features like property rights, rule of law, investment in human capital, openness to trade. They also show us what doesn't work. North Korea's total state control, Zimbabwe's property rights violations, Haiti's institutional weakness, Myanmar's isolation, these produced poverty despite educated populations or natural resources or initial advantages. Extractive institutions prevent development. Inclusive institutions foster it. The pattern holds across diverse contexts. Let that settle in your mind. Same starting points, different institutions, radically different outcomes. The comparisons make visible what theory describes. They show that choices matter, that history could have gone differently, that the distribution of wealth and poverty across countries isn't natural or inevitable, but the result of specific decisions and institutions and policies. And if institutions created current patterns, then changing institutions can create different patterns. The future isn't written. Countries can choose different paths. The question is how, what changes are needed, what modern challenges they face. That's where we turn finally to the present moment and the future, to where these forces we've explored are carrying us. The comparisons we've examined show that choices matter, that institutions shape destinies, that history could have gone differently and still can. Same starting points, different decisions, radically different outcomes. The patterns are clear across diverse contexts and time periods, but these comparisons have mostly looked backward, examining how countries diverged over decades. Now let's arrive at the present moment, at the world as it exists today, and consider where these forces we've explored are carrying us. The story of global inequality isn't over. Some trends offer hope, others create new challenges. The future remains unwritten, shaped by choices countries are making now and will make in years ahead. Begin with something remarkable that often goes unnoticed. Extreme poverty has fallen dramatically over recent decades. The World Bank defines extreme poverty as living on less than $2.15 per day, adjusted for purchasing power. This is desperate poverty, insufficient food, no healthcare, minimal shelter, constant insecurity. In 1990, about 36% of humanity lived in extreme poverty. That's nearly 2 billion people. By 2020, the proportion had fallen to around 9%, despite global population increasing substantially. In absolute terms, extreme poverty fell from nearly 2 billion to around 700 million people. This represents one of history's great achievements. Hundreds of millions of people escaped desperate poverty, gained access to adequate food and clean water, and basic healthcare and education. Their lives improved in fundamental ways. This didn't happen through charity or aid primarily. It happened through economic growth in poor countries, particularly in Asia. China's role in this poverty reduction is central. When China began economic reforms in 1978, over 80% of Chinese lived in extreme poverty. That's roughly 800 million people. Through rapid economic growth, averaging around 9% annually for 4 decades, China lifted approximately 800 million people from extreme poverty. This is the largest and fastest poverty reduction in human history. China's success came from the institutional changes we discussed, allowing private enterprise, opening to trade, investing in infrastructure and education, maintaining social stability. The Chinese approach wasn't democratic, wasn't built on human rights or political freedom. It was authoritarian capitalism, state-directed but market-based. Whether this model is sustainable or replicable elsewhere remains debated, but its poverty reduction results are undeniable. India's experience is different but also significant. India's economic liberalization beginning in the early 1990s accelerated growth. Hundreds of millions of Indians escaped poverty. The middle class expanded dramatically. India developed globally competitive industries in information technology, pharmaceuticals, services. Poverty rates fell from over 50% in the early 1980s to around 20% by 2020. India's challenges differ from China's. It's democratic, which creates different constraints and possibilities. It has greater ethnic and linguistic diversity. Economic growth has been less evenly distributed. Some states like Kerala and Tamil Nadu have done well, while others like Bihar lag badly. Inequality has increased. Infrastructure remains inadequate. But the overall trajectory has been toward greater prosperity and poverty reduction. These Asian success stories drive what economists call the Great Convergence, the narrowing of income gaps between poor and rich countries that has occurred since around 2000. For most of the 19th and 20th centuries, the gap between richest and poorest countries widened, the Great Divergence we discussed earlier. But since 2000, many poor countries have grown faster than wealthy countries, beginning to close the gap. This convergence isn't universal. Sub-Saharan Africa has experienced growth, but from such low levels that absolute gaps remain enormous. Some countries remain mired in poverty and conflict. The poorest countries aren't catching up. But a substantial middle group, countries like Vietnam, Bangladesh, Ethiopia, Indonesia, have achieved sustained growth, raising living standards significantly. Yet even as some gaps narrow, others persist or widen. Inequality within countries has increased in many places. In China, coastal cities like Shanghai and Shenzhen are wealthy and modern, while rural interior regions remain much poorer. In India, the difference between Bangalore's tech sector and rural Bihar is vast. In the United States and other wealthy countries, the gap between college-educated urban professionals and less educated workers in declining industrial regions has grown. Technology contributes to this within-country inequality. High-skilled workers who can use advanced technologies earn far more than low-skilled workers whose jobs are automated or moved offshore. The rewards to education and talent have increased. Those without education or in sectors facing automation or trade competition have seen wages stagnate or fall. This creates political tensions, fuels populism, challenges the idea that globalization benefits everyone. Climate change adds a new and particularly difficult dimension to development challenges. The scientific consensus is clear. Human activity, primarily burning fossil fuels, is warming the planet. This warming will have dramatic effects: rising sea levels, more intense storms, shifting agricultural zones, heat waves, droughts, floods. These effects will disproportionately harm poor countries. Bangladesh, a low-lying country of 160 million people, faces existential threat from sea level rise. Much of the country is barely above sea level. Even modest rises will inundate substantial areas, displacing millions. Small island nations like the Maldives or Kiribati could disappear entirely under the waves. Their populations will become climate refugees with nowhere to go. Agricultural impacts will hit poor countries hardest. Sub-Saharan Africa depends heavily on rain-fed agriculture. Changes in rainfall patterns could devastate food production. Heat stress will reduce crop yields. Droughts will become more frequent and severe. Poor farmers lacking irrigation or access to improved seeds will suffer most. Food insecurity could increase just as population continues growing. The cruelty is that poor countries contributed least to climate change but will suffer most from its effects. Wealthy countries industrialized using fossil fuels, creating the emissions that caused warming. Poor countries industrialize little and emit far less per person. Yet they're more vulnerable. They're often in tropical regions more affected by warming. They lack resources to adapt. Their infrastructure is less resilient. Their populations have fewer options for coping with disasters. Wealthy countries have both moral and practical obligations to help poor countries adapt to climate change and to mitigate further warming. But climate finance has been inadequate. Wealthy countries promised $100 billion annually to help poor countries address climate change. They've fallen short of this target. Meanwhile, the costs of adaptation will be far higher, hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars for seawalls, irrigation systems, disaster preparedness, relocating populations, developing climate-resilient agriculture. Climate change also affects the development path available to poor countries. Wealthy countries developed through industrialization powered by coal and oil. Should poor countries be denied the same path? They argue that they need to develop first, that they can't afford expensive renewable energy, that wealthy countries should bear the cost of transition. Wealthy countries argue that the planet can't sustain China and India and Africa developing the way Europe and North America did, that everyone must transition to clean energy. Fortunately, renewable energy costs have fallen dramatically. Solar panels and wind turbines have become cost competitive with fossil fuels in many contexts. This creates opportunities for poor countries to leapfrog fossil fuel infrastructure, developing with clean energy from the start. Just as mobile phones allowed countries to skip building landline networks, distributed solar power might allow countries to skip building centralized grids powered by coal. But challenges remain. Renewable energy requires substantial upfront investment. It's intermittent. The sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow, requiring storage or backup. Poor countries often lack capital for investment and technical capacity for maintenance. They need financing and technology transfer from wealthy countries, which has been slow and inadequate. Automation and artificial intelligence create another uncertainty about development paths. Manufacturing employment, which lifted East Asian countries from poverty, may not be available as a development strategy for today's poor countries. Factories increasingly use robots and automated systems requiring few workers. If wealthy countries can produce goods cheaply with automation, why would they offshore production to poor countries? This could be devastating for countries counting on manufacturing to generate employment and growth. Bangladesh's garment industry employs millions, mostly women, producing clothes for global markets. If automation makes it cheaper to produce clothes in Europe or America with robots, what happens to those millions of workers? What alternative development path exists if manufacturing doesn't employ people? Some argue that services could provide alternative employment: call centres, software development, business process outsourcing. India's IT sector shows this is possible. But services often require higher education levels than manufacturing. They may not provide employment for less educated workers the way factory work did. And some services are also being automated. Artificial intelligence can handle customer service, translate documents, analyze data. The optimistic view is that technology always creates new jobs even as it destroys old ones. No one in 1900 could have imagined the jobs that exist today. Software engineers, data scientists, social media managers. Similarly, we can't imagine jobs that will exist in 2050. Technology creates opportunities alongside disruptions. Human creativity and adaptation will find new ways to create value. The pessimistic view is that this time is different, that artificial intelligence and automation will eliminate jobs faster than new ones are created, that many people will become unemployable not through any fault of their own, but because machines can do their work better and cheaper. This could require fundamentally rethinking how economies provide for people, perhaps through universal basic income or radically shorter work weeks or other approaches we can't yet envision. Migration represents both response to inequality and source of controversy. Hundreds of millions of people live outside their birth countries, seeking opportunity or fleeing conflict or climate disaster. Remittances, money sent home by migrants, totaled around $550 billion in 2019, far exceeding the roughly $150 billion in foreign aid. For many countries, remittances are the largest source of foreign exchange. Migration creates benefits for migrants who earn far more than they could at home, and for their families who receive remittances. It benefits destination countries, which gain workers and consumers and taxpayers, despite political narratives suggesting otherwise, and it can benefit origin countries through remittances and knowledge transfer when migrants return or maintain connections. But migration also creates costs and tensions. Brain drain removes skilled workers from poor countries that invested in their education. Families are separated. Migrants often face discrimination and exploitation. And politically, immigration has become contentious in many wealthy countries, fueling nationalist movements, creating backlash, leading to restrictive policies. The ethics are complex. Do people have rights to move to where opportunities exist? Do countries have rights to control who enters? How should burdens and benefits of migration be distributed? As climate change creates more refugees, as inequality drives more migration, these questions will become more pressing. Debt burdens constrain many poor countries' development options. Countries borrowed heavily in the 1970s, when interest rates were low and commodity prices high. When rates rose and prices fell in the 1980s, debt became unsustainable. Structural adjustment programs imposed by the IMF and World Bank required cutting government spending, privatizing services, opening markets. These programs often worsened poverty and social services while benefiting foreign creditors. Debt relief programs in the late 1990s and 2000s helped some countries, but new debt has accumulated. China's Belt and Road Initiative has loaned hundreds of billions to developing countries for infrastructure. Some countries now owe substantial debt to China, raising concerns about dependency and debt traps. The COVID-19 pandemic forced countries to borrow heavily to address health crises and economic collapse, adding to debt burdens. High debt means governments must spend on interest payments rather than education or healthcare or infrastructure. It limits policy options. It makes countries vulnerable to economic shocks. Some argue for debt cancellation, that unpayable debts should be forgiven to give countries fresh starts. Others argue this creates moral hazard, encouraging irresponsible borrowing. The debate continues without resolution. Foreign aid, which we've mentioned several times, remains contentious. Jeffrey Sachs argues for scaling up aid, that well-designed programs addressing health and agriculture and infrastructure can jumpstart development. He points to successes like malaria control and agricultural improvements. William Easterly counters that aid often fails, that it creates dependency, that it flows to corrupt governments. That development happens through bottom-up learning, not top-down planning. The evidence suggests both are partly right. Some aid succeeds. Vaccination programs, disaster relief, specific technical assistance. Some aid fails. Large infrastructure projects that aren't maintained. Budget support to corrupt governments. Programs that don't fit local contexts. Good aid requires understanding local conditions, partnering with local organizations, focusing on building capacity, being accountable for results. But even good aid can't substitute for domestic institutions and policies. Cryptocurrency and mobile banking offer interesting possibilities for financial inclusion. Billions of people globally lack access to formal banking. They can't save safely, can't access credit, can't make digital payments. Mobile money services like Kenya's M-Pesa allow people with phones to store and transfer money without bank accounts. Cryptocurrencies could potentially provide similar services globally, but cryptocurrencies also pose risks: extreme volatility, using crime, environmental cost of mining, potential for financial instability. Their development impact remains uncertain. They could democratize finance or could create new forms of exploitation. Time will tell whether they become tools for inclusion or just speculative assets. Thinking about the future means acknowledging uncertainty. Current trends could continue, some countries catching up through growth while others lag, technology advancing rapidly with uncertain employment effects, climate change worsening unless dramatic action is taken, migration increasing as inequality and climate drive movement. Or trends could shift, new technologies could create unexpected opportunities, institutional reforms could unlock growth in stagnating countries, international cooperation on climate could prevent worst outcomes, or conversely, conflicts could spread, nationalism could fracture global economy, pandemics or climate disasters could reverse development gains. What's clear is that the patterns we've explored — geography, institutions, human capital, trade, technology, conflict — will continue shaping outcomes. Countries will make choices about institutions and policies. Those choices will matter. Development isn't predetermined. It's contingent on human decisions on leadership and governance and priorities. The optimistic view sees enormous potential. Technology could solve problems that have plagued humanity. Renewable energy addressing climate change, medical advances extending healthy life, artificial intelligence augmenting human capabilities, instant communication connecting everyone. Poor countries could catch up as knowledge diffuses, as technology becomes cheaper and more accessible, as institutions improve and human capital develops. The pessimistic view sees deepening crises, climate change causing disasters and displacement, automation creating mass unemployment, inequality increasing within and between countries, institutions failing or becoming more extractive, conflicts spreading, the international system fragmenting. Current wealth could prove temporary, built on exhausting resources and destabilizing climate. More likely, the future will be mixed. Progress in some areas and countries, stagnation or decline in others, new problems emerging as old ones are solved, continuous struggle and adaptation. Development isn't a destination but a process, always incomplete, always contested, requiring constant effort to maintain, let alone advance. The question of why some countries are rich and others poor doesn't have a simple answer, because the factors are multiple, interacting, changing over time. Geography shapes possibilities. History creates path dependencies. Institutions determine whether opportunities are seized or squandered. Human capital development unlocks potential. Trade connects countries to markets and ideas. Technology multiplies productivity. Conflict destroys. Choices matter at every level: individual, community, national, global. Understanding these patterns doesn't automatically tell us what to do. Should wealthy countries provide more aid or less? Should poor countries emphasize manufacturing or services or agriculture? Should institutions be reformed gradually or radically? Should countries prioritize growth or distribution? Stability or change? These are political questions with ethical dimensions. The answers depend on values and context, but understanding patterns helps us think more clearly about possibilities and constraints. It reveals that poverty isn't natural or inevitable. It shows that countries have developed despite obstacles, that choices and institutions matter more than geography or history alone. It suggests that the current distribution of wealth and poverty could be different, could change, is the result of specific processes that could go differently. The world is unequal, but it's changing. Some countries rise while others struggle. The patterns we've explored, geography, institutions, human capital, trade, technology, continue to shape outcomes, but human choices shape them too. The future isn't written. Countries can choose different paths. Whether those paths lead toward greater equality and prosperity, or toward deeper divisions and crises, depends on decisions being made now and in years ahead. That's both hopeful, change is possible, and sobering, change requires wisdom and effort and often sacrifice. Both are true, both matter, both shape the world our children will inherit. We've journeyed together through mountains and coastlines, through centuries of history and human choices, through institutions and conflicts, and the slow, patient work of building prosperity. We've seen how geography shapes possibilities without determining destinies, how history influences without imprisoning, how human decisions matter more than we sometimes believe. The world is unequal, complex, often unjust. But it's also changing, always changing, shaped by millions of choices made by ordinary people trying to build better lives. Countries that seem trapped can transform. Patterns that seem permanent can shift. The future isn't written in stone or soil or genes. It's written in institutions and education and the choices we make about how to live together. You've spent this time exploring one of humanity's deepest questions, seeking to understand why the world is the way it is. Whether you're still listening or have drifted into sleep, thank you for this journey. May you rest now, letting these ideas settle like sediment, forming layers of understanding. Sleep well, wherever you are. Dream perhaps of mountains and rivers, of people building and creating despite obstacles, of human ingenuity solving ancient problems. Dream of a world where geography and history don't determine everything, where choices matter, where change is possible. Let it all go now. Just rest. Good night. Good.